The night air over the Nile River was still warm. Even after the sun had disappeared beyond the western desert, a gentle heat remained in the mud-brick walls of the village. The day's warmth lingered in the stone paths and in the packed earth beneath bare feet. It rested quietly inside sleeping homes and drifted through narrow alleys where only a few lamps still glowed. The river moved through the darkness with almost no sound. Its black surface reflected scattered stars. Reeds along the shoreline swayed slowly whenever a faint breeze crossed the water. Somewhere far away, a fisherman adjusted a rope in his boat. Somewhere else, a dog barked once and then settled down again. Most people were asleep. Tomorrow would begin early. It always began early. Long before sunrise, while the sky was still dark and deep blue, many families would already be awake. They would rise from woven mats spread across floors of packed earth. They would rub tired eyes. They would stretch stiff backs. They would prepare themselves for another day that looked very much like the day before. For a child growing up in ancient Egypt, softness was not often part of daily life. The world was not built around comfort. The world was built around work. A child learned this almost as soon as they could walk. Inside a small mud brick house near the Nile, a young boy slept beside his brothers and sisters. There were no separate bedrooms. There was little privacy. Family members rested close together, sharing the same space, breathing the same warm air. The walls around them were simple. Their roof was made from wooden beams covered with reeds and mud. During the hottest months, people sometimes slept outside on rooftops where cooler air moved more freely during the night. The boy's sleeping mat was thin. His pillow, if he had one, might be a carved wooden headrest rather than anything soft. His blanket might be little more than a simple cloth. Yet this was normal. Nearly everyone around him slept the same way. No one expected great comfort. Comfort was not something most people thought about very often. When darkness still covered the village, his mother stirred awake. The sounds were familiar. A quiet movement. A rustle of fabric. The soft scrape of a clay pot being lifted. Soon the household began to wake one by one. Outside, the stars still filled the sky. The air felt cooler now than it would later. These were precious hours. The coolness would not last. By midday, the heat would return. It always returned. The boy sat up slowly. His muscles already felt tired even though the day had not begun. Children often worked alongside adults. Their tasks were smaller, but their responsibilities were real. A childhood filled with play existed in brief moments between duties. Work came first. The family moved quietly. Someone stepped outside to fetch water. Someone else prepared grain. A small fire crackled. The smell of baking bread slowly entered the room. It was one of the most familiar smells in ancient Egypt. Bread was life. Every day began and ended with it. The boy watched his mother shape dough with practiced hands. She had done this thousands of times before. Her movements were calm and efficient. There was no rushing. Only routine. The same routine repeated across countless villages stretching beside the Nile. As dawn approached, pale light appeared along the eastern horizon. Birds began to stir. The river slowly changed color. Dark blue became gray. Gray became silver. Then gold. Morning arrived gently. Workers gathered tools. Farmers prepared for fields. Boats pushed away from shore. The village awakened completely. The child stepped outside. Dust rested across the ground. The air smelled faintly of river water, damp reeds, and baking bread. Already he knew what the day would bring. Tasks. Instructions. Repetition. The lessons of childhood often came through labor rather than words. A child learned by watching, then by helping, then by doing. Many boys joined their fathers in fields. Many girls worked beside mothers, sisters, and relatives inside homes or workshops. The exact tasks varied, but the pattern remained similar. Children became useful as early as possible. This was not considered harsh. It was simply necessary. Life depended on many hands working together. The Nile made life possible, but survival still required effort. Fields needed planting. Canals needed clearing. Animals needed tending. Food needed preparation. Everything required labor. The boy followed his father toward farmland near the river. The morning sun climbed higher. Golden light spread across green fields. The contrast between fertile land and desert remained striking. One side held life and growth. The other held endless sand and stone. Between them stood villages, farms, and people whose daily routines followed the rhythm of the river. The child carried a small tool. Not because anyone wished to burden him. Because work needed doing. Because every family depended on cooperation. Because childhood and adulthood were not separated by many years of protected comfort. Children slowly entered the world of responsibility almost from the beginning. As they walked, the boy's father said little. Conversation was often practical. Energy was precious. The day ahead would be long. Soon they reached the fields. Workers were already there. Men and women moved through rows of crops. The sounds were simple. Footsteps. Bird calls. Water flowing through irrigation channels. Tools brushing against soil. The boy joined them. His tasks were smaller. Still, they mattered. Hours passed slowly. The sun climbed. Heat gathered. Shadows shortened. Sweat appeared. The cool freshness of morning faded away. By midday the world seemed wrapped in warmth. The earth radiated heat. The air itself felt heavy. Many workers paused briefly. Some sat beneath sparse shade. Others rested beside walls. Water jars were shared carefully. The child drank slowly. The water was not cold. Cold water was rare. Yet it refreshed him enough. Nearby, older workers closed tired eyes for a few moments. Faces showed years of labor. Hands showed years of labor. Backs showed years of labor. Life left marks on the body. Children saw those marks every day. They understood from an early age what adulthood looked like. The afternoon stretched onward. The pace remained steady. There were no dramatic moments. No sudden changes. Just work. Step after step. Task after task. The rhythm itself shaped childhood. Many children grew accustomed to physical exhaustion before reaching adulthood. Tiredness became familiar. Not frightening. Simply familiar. As the day slowly moved toward evening, the sun softened. Long shadows returned. The heat eased little by little. Workers gathered tools. Animals were guided home. Boats drifted back toward shore. A feeling of relief settled over the village. The hardest hours had passed. The child walked home. Dust clung to his feet. His shoulders ached. Yet there was comfort in returning. The smell of cooking drifted through the air. Families gathered. Doors opened. Voices carried softly through narrow streets. Inside the home, food was prepared. Simple meals filled bowls. Bread. vegetables, fish when available, perhaps beans, perhaps onions, perhaps dates. Nothing extravagant. Yet after a long day, even simple food felt welcome. The family ate together. Oil lamps flickered. Their warm glow danced across walls. Outside, darkness slowly returned. The village quieted. Children listened to conversations between adults. Stories passed from one generation to another. Advice passed from one generation to another. Knowledge passed from one generation to another. This was education for many children. Not through books. Not through classrooms. Through listening. Through observing. Through participating in daily life. A few children might eventually become scribes. Those children followed a different path. They spent long hours practicing symbols and writing exercises. Their childhood carried its own difficulties. Learning to write required patience and discipline. A young apprentice scribe often sat for hours copying signs repeatedly. Mistakes were corrected. Exercises were repeated. Progress came slowly. Even for them, softness remained rare. The world valued endurance. As night deepened, families prepared for sleep. The day's labor lingered in tired muscles. The smell of baked bread still rested faintly in the air. Somewhere nearby, river water touched the shore with gentle sounds. A breeze moved across rooftops. The stars emerged again. The child lay down. The same mat. The same room. The same familiar surroundings. Tomorrow would look much like today. And the day after that. And the day after that. Childhood moved forward through repetition. Not because imagination was absent. Not because affection was absent. Families loved their children. Parents cared deeply. But love often appeared through protection, guidance, food, and survival rather than softness. A mother woke before dawn to prepare bread. A father worked beneath a burning sun to support his family. Brothers and sisters shared burdens together. These were forms of care. Quiet forms. Practical forms. Forms shaped by necessity. Outside, the Nile continued its slow journey through the darkness. The river had watched countless generations grow from childhood into adulthood. It had seen children carrying water jars. Children helping in fields. Children learning trades. Children falling asleep beneath warm desert skies. And tonight, as stars reflected across calm water, another child closed tired eyes and drifted into sleep while the ancient world around him settled into silence. The night remained warm. The village remained quiet. And the river continued flowing beneath the stars. The hours before dawn were often the quietest of all. The village rested beneath a blanket of darkness that felt gentle rather than frightening. Above, the stars stretched across the sky in great numbers, clear and steady. Their light touched the Nile and shimmered softly upon the slow-moving water. Along the riverbanks, reeds whispered whenever a breeze drifted through them. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and river mud. Most homes were silent. Families slept close together behind mudbrick walls that still held traces of yesterday's warmth. The packed earth floors had cooled during the night. Thin mats lay side by side. Children slept beside parents, brothers beside sisters, and grandparents sometimes rested nearby as well. For many children, sleep came quickly. A day of labor left little energy for wakefulness. Their bodies knew the rhythm of work. They rose early. They worked steadily. They rested when darkness returned. Night after night, year after year, the pattern remained much the same. A young girl sleeping near the edge of the village stirred slightly as a breeze entered through a small opening in the wall. She shifted beneath a simple cloth and listened for a moment without fully waking. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a donkey moved quietly. Then everything became still again. Soon enough, the darkness would begin to fade. Morning always arrived. It arrived whether workers felt rested or not. It arrived whether muscles still ached from the day before. It arrived whether children wished to remain asleep. The ancient world moved according to the sun. And before long, faint color began to appear along the eastern horizon. At first it was barely noticeable. The blackness softened into deep blue. Then came a pale band of gray. Then a touch of silver. Birds awakened before most people. Their calls echoed gently through the morning air. The Nile reflected the changing sky. The water seemed to wake alongside the land. Inside homes, movement began. A mother sat up slowly and rubbed her eyes. A father stretched his back. Children rolled from their sleeping mats. The day was beginning again. The girl stood and stepped onto the cool floor. For a brief moment she enjoyed the freshness of the morning. These early hours were precious. The heat had not yet arrived. The air still felt gentle against the skin. Soon she joined her mother. Already grain was being prepared. Clay vessels were lifted. Firewood was arranged. The familiar work of the household resumed. Children often learned these tasks long before reaching adulthood. A young girl might spend years helping with food preparation, carrying water, cleaning spaces, caring for younger children, and assisting wherever needed. There was no sharp line dividing childhood from responsibility. Responsibilities arrived gradually. A small task became a larger task. A larger task became a daily duty. And over time, a child became an adult almost without noticing exactly when the change occurred. The smell of bread soon filled the home. It drifted through the room in warm waves. Outside, similar smells appeared throughout the village. Nearly every household prepared some form of bread. The scent became part of daily life. It mixed with the smell of smoke from cooking fires and the faint scent of river water carried by the wind. The girl helped shape dough. Her hands had practiced these movements many times before. Not perfectly. Not yet. But she was learning. Learning often happened through repetition. Someone demonstrated a task. The child watched. Then tried. Then practiced. Then practiced again. This method shaped nearly every part of life. Few people received formal instruction. Most knowledge passed directly from one generation to another. A mother taught a daughter. A father taught a son. An experienced worker taught an apprentice. The lessons were practical. The lessons were daily. The lessons never truly ended. As sunlight spread across the landscape, the village became fully awake. Doors opened. Voices drifted through the streets. Animals stirred. Workers gathered tools. Boats prepared to leave shore. The day unfolded with familiar certainty. The girl balanced a clay jar against her side and walked toward a water source with several other children. The path beneath her sandals felt rough. Dust rose gently with each step. The village roads were simple. Years of footsteps had worn them smooth in places. The children walked together. Some talked quietly. Others remained silent. Their morning energy had not fully arrived. Ahead, the Nile gleamed beneath the growing sunlight. The river was everything. It provided water. It supported farming. It carried boats and goods. It shaped schedules and seasons. Without the Nile, much of Egypt would have been empty desert. Children understood its importance from the beginning of life. They saw it every day. They depended upon it every day. The girl filled her jar carefully. Water rippled around her hands. The morning sun reflected across the surface in scattered flashes of gold. Nearby, fishermen prepared nets. Their boats rested low in the water. They moved with quiet confidence gained through years of experience. Some had learned these skills as children. Now they taught the same skills to younger generations. Life moved in circles. One generation followed another. The work remained. The river remained. The sun remained. As the morning progressed, the village settled into its routine. The girl returned home carrying water. The jar felt heavy. Her arms were accustomed to the weight, yet it still required effort. Children often developed strength gradually through countless small tasks like this one. The work was not always dramatic. Most of it was ordinary. But ordinary work filled nearly every day. Inside the home, preparations continued. Food needed attention. Cleaning needed attention. Repairs needed attention. Every household contained a long list of tasks waiting to be completed. There was little idle time. The hours passed steadily. Sunlight brightened. Heat increased. The coolness of dawn slowly disappeared. By late morning, the familiar warmth of Egypt settled over everything. The village seemed to move more slowly. Workers paced themselves carefully. The afternoon would be hotter still. The girl helped her mother weave fibers into useful household items. Nearby, another child watched over a younger sibling. Elsewhere, boys assisted fathers in workshops or fields. Some children learned pottery. Some learned fishing. Some learned carpentry. Some learned farming. Every skill required patience. Every skill required repetition. The crowded workshops of larger towns offered another view of childhood. There, young apprentices spent long hours surrounded by experienced craftsmen. The air smelled of wood shavings, clay, leather, and dust. Tools tapped rhythmically against stone and wood. Sunlight entered through doorways and small openings. Children watched carefully. Mistakes were expected. Improvement came slowly. No one hurried the process. Mastery required years. A young apprentice might spend days performing the same simple task. Then weeks. Then months. Only gradually would greater responsibilities be given. The work itself became the teacher. Meanwhile, far from the workshops, fields stretched beside irrigation canals. Farmers worked beneath a bright sky. The sun climbed higher. Heat shimmered above the earth. Children helping in these fields quickly learned the feeling of exhaustion. The weight of tools. The ache of tired legs. The dryness of a thirsty throat. Such experiences became familiar companions. Not every day felt difficult. Some days felt peaceful. Some days brought satisfaction. Yet physical labor remained a constant presence. By midday, workers searched for shade whenever possible. A wall. A tree. A shelter made from reeds. Any relief from direct sunlight felt welcome. The girl sat briefly with her family. A meal was shared. Simple food. Bread and vegetables. Perhaps a few dates. Perhaps fish from the river. The meal was not large. But it provided enough energy to continue. Nearby, an older relative closed tired eyes. Years of labor had etched themselves into every movement. Hands were rough. Skin was weathered. Yet there was also quiet wisdom in those faces. Children grew up surrounded by examples of endurance. They observed adults meeting responsibilities day after day. These observations became lessons without words. The afternoon stretched onward. Heat pressed against the land. Even the animals seemed quieter. Dust hung motionless in the air. The distant desert shimmered beneath the sunlight. For a child, these long afternoons could feel endless. Yet life continued at its steady pace. Tasks were completed one by one. Work gradually filled the hours until evening finally approached. Then, almost without warning, the quality of light began to change. The harsh brightness softened. Shadows lengthened. The sky slowly shifted toward gold. A feeling of relief spread through the village. The hottest hours were ending. People moved more comfortably now. Conversations became easier. Children sensed the change immediately. Even tired bodies seemed lighter. The girl stepped outside and watched sunlight reflect across the Nile. The river glowed. Birds schemed across the water. Boats drifted toward shore. The scene felt peaceful. Moments like this existed even within demanding lives. Quiet moments. Beautiful moments. Small pauses between responsibilities. As evening settled over the land, cooking fires appeared once more. Smoke rose gently into the sky. The smell of bread returned again. Families gathered. The village softened. The noise of labor faded. Voices replaced tools. Stories replaced instructions. Children sat nearby and listened. Sometimes elders spoke about family members long gone. Sometimes they spoke about seasons of flood and drought. Sometimes they simply described ordinary memories. The stories were rarely dramatic. Most were simple. Yet they connected generations together. The girl listened while shadows deepened around the room. The oil lamp flickered softly. Its warm light danced across mud-brick walls. Outside, darkness slowly returned to the village. The stars began appearing one by one. The day's heat gradually escaped into the night air. Workers stretched aching muscles. Children yawned. The rhythm of life continued exactly as it had for countless evenings before. Soon sleeping mats were prepared once more. The girl lay down beside her family. Her arms felt tired. Her legs felt heavy. The familiar exhaustion of the day settled over her like a blanket. Outside, the Nile flowed beneath the stars. The river moved quietly through the darkness. Its waters carried reflections of distant lights and ancient constellations. Somewhere along the shore, a fisherman finished securing his boat. Somewhere else, a farmer looked briefly toward the sky before entering his home. The village grew still. Only the occasional sound disturbed the silence. A breeze moving through reeds. Water touching the shore. A distant animal shifting in the darkness. The girl listened for a moment. Then her eyes closed. Sleep arrived gently. Another day had passed. Another day would come soon enough. And beneath the vast Egyptian sky, beside the patient waters of the Nile, childhood continued its slow journey through labor, family, routine, and the quiet endurance that shaped so much of life in the ancient world. The night moved quietly across the Nile Valley. Darkness rested upon the fields like a soft blanket. The day's heat had finally loosened its grip on the earth. Mud-brick walls slowly released the warmth they had gathered beneath the sun. Across villages and towns, families slept beneath roofs of reeds and clay while the river continued its endless journey northward. The Nile never seemed hurried. Generation after generation watched its waters pass by. Children were born beside it. They grew beside it. They worked beside it, and eventually they grew old beside it. The river remained. Long before dawn, when the stars still shone brightly overhead, a faint breeze crossed the water and drifted through a small farming village. It carried the scent of damp reeds and fertile soil. Somewhere in the darkness, a boat rocked gently against its mooring post. Inside one modest home, a young boy shifted upon his sleeping mat. His dreams faded slowly. For a few moments he remained half asleep, listening to the quiet sounds around him. A parent breathing nearby. The distant murmur of the river. The occasional creak of wooden roof beams. These sounds had surrounded him for his entire life. They felt comforting. Familiar. Steady. The ancient world could be difficult, but it was also predictable. Children often knew exactly what tomorrow would bring. The same chores. The same pathways. The same responsibilities. The same people. There was comfort hidden within routine. Outside, the sky remained dark. Yet already some adults were awake. The earliest workers often rose before the first light appeared. A baker might begin preparing grain. A fisherman might check his nets. A farmer might prepare tools before walking toward the fields. Life depended upon making use of every hour available. The boy finally sat up. His body felt stiff from yesterday's work. This feeling was normal. Most adults felt it. Many children felt it too. Physical labor shaped daily existence. It shaped posture. It shaped muscles. It shaped expectations. The boy stretched quietly. Nearby, his mother was already awake. A small cooking fire glowed softly. Its orange light flickered against the walls. The room smelled faintly of smoke and grain. Soon bread would be baking. Soon another day would begin. He stepped outside. The village still slept beneath the stars. The air felt cool against his skin. For a moment he simply stood there. The silence before dawn possessed a special quality. It felt larger somehow. The world seemed wider. The sounds of daily life had not yet arrived. No conversations echoed through the streets. No tools struck stone. No animals pulled carts. Only quiet. Only darkness. Only the river moving steadily through the night. Then slowly, almost unnoticed, the eastern horizon began to change. The darkness softened. A faint gray line appeared. Birds awakened among reeds and palm trees. One call answered another. Soon the village would wake completely. The boy walked with his father toward the fields. The ground beneath their sandals felt cool and firm. Dust had settled during the night. Their shadows stretched long behind them as dawn approached. Neither spoke very much. Conversation often came later. The early morning was a time for thought. For preparation. For simply moving forward into another day. Ahead of them, other workers appeared. Small figures emerging from homes and pathways. Some carried tools. Others carried baskets. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they needed to be. The rhythm of village life required little explanation. Children learned these patterns early. By watching. By helping. By participating. The lessons of adulthood began long before adulthood itself arrived. As sunlight finally touched the land, colors emerged. The fields became green. The river became silver and gold. The desert beyond the fertile valley glowed softly beneath the morning light. Ancient Egypt often appeared beautiful at this hour. The harshness of midday remained far away. The world seemed calm. Gentle. Almost peaceful enough to forget the labor waiting ahead. The workers entered the fields. Water flowed through irrigation channels cut carefully into the earth. The Nile's yearly floods had always shaped these lands, bringing rich soil that made farming possible. Children learned about these cycles from the beginning of life. They watched adults observe the river. They listened to conversations about water levels and planting seasons. The Nile determined much of their future. When the river flourished, communities flourished. When difficulties came, everyone felt their effects. The boy's task today was simple. He helped clear small weeds from growing crops. The work required patience more than strength. Hour after hour he bent down, worked carefully, and moved forward. The process felt repetitive. Many parts of childhood felt repetitive. Yet repetition was how skills developed. Repetition was how villages functioned. Repetition was how families survived. The sun climbed steadily. Morning passed. The coolness disappeared. Heat slowly gathered across the landscape. By late morning, workers could already feel it settling upon their shoulders. The sunlight became brighter. The air became heavier. Sweat appeared. Children noticed the change just as adults did. Ancient Egypt was a land of sunlight. Abundant sunlight. Endless sunlight. Beautiful sunlight. And sometimes exhausting sunlight. The boy paused briefly and looked toward the Nile. Its waters shimmered in the distance. The sight always seemed calming. Perhaps it was because the river never changed too quickly. Perhaps it was because its presence meant life itself. Whatever the reason, many people found comfort simply by looking at it. Nearby, an older farmer adjusted a cloth covering his head. Years of labor showed in every movement. His hands were rough and weathered. His face carried deep lines formed beneath countless seasons of sun and wind. The boy had known him his entire life. Children grew up surrounded by such figures. Adults who seemed as permanent as the fields themselves. Adults who had already spent decades following the same routines. Adults who quietly demonstrated endurance through example rather than words. As midday approached, the heat became difficult to ignore. Workers moved more slowly. Energy had to be conserved. The land itself seemed to grow silent. Even birds appeared less active. The air shimmered above the ground. Distant objects looked slightly blurred through waves of warmth. At last a brief period of rest arrived. Workers gathered beneath whatever shade they could find. Some sat against walls. Some rested beneath trees. Others simply crouched beside irrigation channels where cooler air lingered. The boy joined his father. A simple meal was shared. Bread. A few vegetables. Water from a clay jar. Nothing elaborate. Nothing wasteful. Just enough. Children in ancient Egypt became familiar with simple meals. Food was valued deeply because so much effort went into producing it. Every loaf of bread represented hours of labor. Fields had been planted. Grain harvested. Grain ground. Dough prepared. Bread baked. The process connected entire communities. While eating, the boy listened to nearby conversations. The topics were ordinary. Crop conditions. Water levels. Family matters. Repairs needing attention. Tomorrow's work. Life often revolved around practical concerns. There was little room for unnecessary complexity. The afternoon returned. The hardest hours of heat arrived. Workers resumed their tasks. The boy felt tired. His legs ached. His back ached. His hands felt sore. Such feelings were familiar companions. Not every child experienced identical responsibilities, but many understood physical fatigue from an early age. Their lives required participation. Families depended upon participation. The ancient world offered few alternatives. Yet even within these demanding routines, moments of beauty continued to appear. A breeze crossing the fields. Birds gathering near the river. Sunlight sparkling across water. The smell of fresh bread drifting from a distant home. The laughter of children finding a few brief moments to play before returning to their duties. Life was not without joy. The joy simply existed alongside responsibility. As afternoon slowly moved toward evening, the sunlight softened. The world seemed to exhale. Workers sensed relief approaching. Shadows stretched across the fields once more. The temperature gradually eased. The hardest part of the day was ending. The boy gathered tools alongside the others. Dust covered his sandals. His clothes carried traces of soil and sweat. His shoulders felt heavy. Yet he also felt a quiet satisfaction. The day's work had been completed. One more day had been added to the countless days before it. The walk home felt slower. The village ahead glowed warmly beneath the setting sun. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Voices drifted through the air. The smell of evening meals welcomed returning workers. Families reunited after long hours apart. Doors stood open. Neighbors exchanged greetings. Children carried water jars. Animals settled into their nightly places. The entire community seemed to relax together. Inside the home, preparations for dinner continued. The boy's mother moved confidently through familiar tasks. Her own day had been full of labor. Food preparation. Cleaning. Repairs. Caring for family members. Countless responsibilities filled her hours from dawn until dusk. Children often witnessed how hard adults worked. The lesson required no explanation. It could be seen everywhere. After eating, the family remained together beneath the soft glow of an oil lamp. Outside, darkness returned gradually. The first stars appeared overhead. The evening breeze carried welcome relief after the heat of the day. For a little while, there was no work to do. Only rest. Only conversation. Only presence. An older relative began speaking about earlier years. About seasons when the Nile had risen especially high. About journeys taken long ago. About people remembered fondly. The boy listened carefully. Children absorbed stories the way fields absorbed water. The stories connected them to the past. To grandparents. To ancestors. To generations whose names were sometimes forgotten but whose lives still shaped the present. Eventually yawns appeared. The day had been long. Tomorrow would begin early. Sleeping mats were arranged once again. The oil lamp burned lower. The room darkened. Outside, the Nile flowed beneath a sky crowded with stars. A fisherman guided his boat toward shore. A guard walked quietly through a distant town. A farmer looked toward the heavens before closing his door for the night. Across the valley, thousands upon thousands of ordinary people prepared for sleep. Builders. Farmers. Servants. Merchants. Fishermen. Scribes. Children. All beneath the same sky. All beneath the same stars. The boy settled onto his mat. The sounds of the village faded one by one. Conversations ended. Doors closed. Cooking fires dimmed. Silence slowly spread across the settlement. Only the river remained awake. The patient river. The ancient river. the river that had watched countless childhoods unfold along its shores. And as cool night air drifted through the village, another peaceful darkness settled over the Nile Valley, carrying the world gently toward another dawn. The Nile moved through the darkness as it always had. Its waters slipped quietly between reeds and riverbanks, reflecting stars that seemed almost close enough to touch. The night air carried a little coolness now, though traces of the day's heat still lingered in the mud-brick walls of homes scattered across the valley. Most of the village slept deeply. Workers rested after long hours beneath the sun. Children rested after long hours beside their families. Animals rested in their shelters. Even the wind seemed quieter during these late hours. Above everything stretched a sky filled with stars. For a child in ancient Egypt, the night sky was a familiar companion. There were no bright lamps illuminating distant roads. No glowing windows stretching across the horizon. Darkness belonged to the land once the sun disappeared. And because the darkness was deeper, the stars appeared brighter. Children often fell asleep beneath them. Sometimes from rooftops during hot seasons. Sometimes while lying near open doorways where cooler air could enter. The stars watched over countless generations. They watched over farmers and fishermen. Over merchants and servants. Over parents and children. And tonight they watched over another village preparing for a new day. The hours passed quietly. Then somewhere in the darkness, a rooster called. A donkey shifted. A door creaked softly. Morning was approaching. The eastern horizon slowly began to lighten. The stars faded one by one. Night loosened its hold upon the valley. Inside a small home near the river, a young girl opened her eyes. For a moment she remained still. The room around her was dim. Shapes appeared slowly as the darkness retreated. Nearby, her younger brother still slept. Her mother was already awake. A familiar smell drifted through the room. Smoke from a cooking fire. The scent felt comforting. Predictable. Another day had begun. The girl sat up and stretched. Her shoulders felt slightly sore. Yesterday had been filled with carrying water and helping prepare food. Tomorrow would likely be much the same. But this was life. Most days were not dramatically different from one another. Life moved through routines repeated again and again. The routines themselves shaped childhood. Outside, dawn spread across the Nile Valley. A soft golden light touched the fields. Palm trees stood motionless against the brightening sky. The river gleamed with silver reflections. Birds emerged from the reeds and began searching for food along the shoreline. The village slowly awakened. Doors opened. Voices appeared. Footsteps crossed dusty paths. Children joined adults in beginning the day's work. The girl stepped outside carrying a clay jar. The air still felt pleasant. Soon the heat would return. Everyone knew it. The cool hours of morning never lasted long. She walked toward the river with several others. The path curved between homes made from mud bricks dried beneath the Egyptian sun. Many houses looked similar. Simple. Practical. Built for necessity rather than comfort. Inside, rooms were often small. Furniture was limited. Life centered around what was useful. A child growing up in such a home learned early that comfort was not something to be expected every day. Yet there was still warmth. Warmth from family. Warmth from shared meals. Warmth from familiar voices. Warmth from knowing one's place within a community. The girl reached the riverbank. Morning sunlight sparkled across the water. Several fishermen were already at work. Their boats floated quietly nearby. Some checked nets. Others prepared equipment for the day ahead. Many had learned these skills during childhood. Years earlier they had stood where younger children stood now, watching carefully and learning through observation. The Nile was a teacher. It taught patience. It taught timing. It taught respect. A fisherman could not command the river. He could only learn to work with it. The girl filled her jar. The weight of water immediately pulled against her arms. She adjusted her grip. This task was familiar. She had performed it countless times before. Children throughout ancient Egypt carried water regularly. The work strengthened muscles. It strengthened endurance. It became part of daily life. As she walked back toward the village, the sun continued rising. Light spread across fields of grain. Farmers were already moving among crops. From a distance, their figures seemed small against the vast landscape. The Nile Valley often felt large to a child. The river stretched far beyond sight. The desert stretched far beyond sight. The sky stretched endlessly overhead. Yet daily life remained focused on small things. A field. A home. A workshop. A family. These small worlds formed the center of existence. Back at home, the girl helped grind grain. This was one of the most common tasks in ancient households. It required time and effort. The work could be tiring. Hour after hour, grain was crushed into flour. The motion repeated again and again. Hands moved. Arms worked. Dust from the grain settled lightly upon skin and clothing. Many children learned this work early. Many adults spent years performing it. The process was ordinary. Yet it was essential. Without flour there was no bread. Without bread there was no meal. Without meals there was no strength for labor. Everything connected. Everything depended upon something else. As the morning continued, sunlight filled the home. The air grew warmer. Outside, village life unfolded steadily. Nearby, a potter worked at shaping clay. His hands moved confidently. Years of practice guided every motion. Beside him, a young apprentice watched carefully. The apprentice was still learning. Learning where to place pressure. Learning how clay responded. Learning patience. Patience was one of the great lessons of ancient life. Many tasks could not be rushed. Plants required time to grow. Craftsmanship required time to develop. Children required time to mature. The ancient world moved more slowly than many modern people might imagine. A great deal of life involved waiting. Waiting for floods. Waiting for harvests. Waiting for journeys. Waiting for seasons to change. The girl continued helping her family. By late morning, the familiar heat settled over the village. The shade beneath walls became valuable. The shade beneath trees became valuable. Even a small patch of shadow offered relief. Workers adjusted their pace. No one could escape the sun entirely. They learned to endure it instead. Heat became another companion. Just as familiar as the river. Just as familiar as the dust beneath their feet. At midday, the village seemed quieter. The brightness of the sun pressed down upon rooftops and pathways. The air shimmered above the ground. Children moved more slowly. Adults moved more slowly. Animals sought shelter whenever possible. Inside homes, meals were shared. Simple food. Simple conversation. Simple moments of rest. The girl sat beside her family. Bread was divided carefully. Water was poured carefully. Nothing was wasted. Every resource carried value. Children learned this lesson from the beginning. Food required labor. Water required labor. Clothing required labor. Everything represented someone's effort. After eating, there was a brief period of calm. The hottest part of the day often encouraged stillness. Some people rested. Others completed tasks indoors where shade provided a little comfort. The girl sat quietly near a doorway. A breeze occasionally entered from outside. She watched sunlight move across the floor. She listened to distant sounds drifting through the village. A donkey braying. A hammer striking wood. Children calling to one another. The sounds blended together into the familiar music of daily life. In larger towns, childhood sometimes looked different. The streets could be crowded. Markets could be busy. Merchants called out to customers. Donkeys carried loads through narrow roads. Workshops overflowed with activity. Children growing up in these places experienced a different rhythm. Yet responsibility remained constant. Whether in village or town, children were expected to contribute when able. A young apprentice in a crowded workshop might spend years performing simple tasks. Sweeping floors. Carrying materials. Watching skilled craftsmen. Learning through repetition. The work could be tedious, but it created knowledge. Knowledge became skill. Skill became livelihood. Afternoon arrived. The sun slowly began its journey downward. Though the heat remained strong, workers sensed that relief would eventually come. The girl accompanied her mother to visit a nearby relative. They walked along dusty paths lined with mud brick homes. Neighbors greeted one another. Children moved between households. Communities were closely connected. People knew one another. They shared information. They shared concerns. They shared celebrations and hardships. Life rarely happened in isolation. Families depended upon one another. The visit was simple. Conversation flowed gently. A younger child played nearby with a handmade toy. An older relative repaired a woven basket. Nothing remarkable occurred. Yet these ordinary moments filled countless days. History often remembers great rulers and monuments. But most lives were built from scenes exactly like this. Simple conversations. Simple meals. Simple work. Simple evenings. As afternoon softened into evening, shadows lengthened across the village. The light became golden. The heat slowly weakened. People emerged from shaded spaces. Activity increased again. Farmers returned from fields. Fishermen returned from the river. Workers returned from workshops. The village gradually gathered itself together after another long day. The girl watched as the sky changed colors. Gold became orange. Orange became pink. Then slowly the colors faded. The Nile reflected every change. Its surface seemed almost magical beneath the evening light. For a moment, the world felt peaceful. Still. Unhurried. Then darkness returned once more. Cooking fires glowed. The smell of bread drifted through the air. Families gathered inside their homes. Oil lamps flickered softly. Stories were exchanged. Children listened. The day's labor slowly faded into memory. Tomorrow would bring more work. But tomorrow had not yet arrived. For now there was only evening. Only family. Only rest. The girl lay down upon her sleeping mat. Outside, the village grew quiet. The stars returned overhead. The river continued its endless journey through the darkness. Its waters reflected the same constellations seen by parents, grandparents, and generations long before them. And as the cool night breeze moved gently across the Nile Valley, another ordinary day slipped peacefully into the past, while countless children throughout ancient Egypt drifted toward sleep beneath the watchful stars. The night settled gently over the Nile Valley. Darkness spread across the fields and villages with a quiet certainty. The day's labor had ended. The heat that had pressed against the land for so many hours slowly drifted away into the open sky. Mud-brick homes stood silent beneath the stars, their walls glowing faintly in the pale light of the moon. The river continued to move. It never seemed to rest. Long after families had fallen asleep, long after cooking fires had faded into ash, the Nile slipped through the darkness as it always had. Its waters carried reflections of stars. Its waters carried the memory of countless generations. Its waters carried life itself. Inside one small village, a young boy slept beside his family. His hands were still rough from helping in the fields. His legs felt heavy from walking dusty roads. The tiredness of the day rested deep inside him. It was the kind of tiredness that arrived honestly. The kind that came from effort. The kind that children in ancient Egypt knew well. For a little while, the world remained perfectly still. Only the faint sounds of insects drifted through the darkness. Only the distant murmur of water could be heard. The stars watched quietly overhead. Then, little by little, another day approached. The eastern horizon began to brighten. Night loosened its hold upon the land. Birds stirred among reeds and palm branches. The cool air carried the smell of damp earth from the riverbanks. A fisherman awakened before dawn and stepped outside his home. A baker rose and prepared grain. A farmer stretched stiff muscles. Across the valley, thousands of people were beginning their day. The boy opened his eyes. For a moment he remained lying on his mat. The room was dim. Shapes appeared slowly in the growing light. His family stirred nearby. No one spoke much. Morning often began quietly. There would be plenty of time for conversation later. First came work. Always work. He sat up and listened. The familiar sounds returned. A clay jar being moved. A fire being prepared. Footsteps crossing the floor. Outside, a donkey brayed softly. The village was waking. The boy stepped outdoors. The air felt cool against his skin. These moments before sunrise were among the most pleasant of the day. The heat had not yet arrived. The sky glowed softly above the eastern horizon. The Nile reflected pale shades of silver and blue. Everything seemed calm. Everything seemed fresh. For a brief time, the world felt almost weightless. But the work ahead remained waiting. The boy joined his father and walked toward a workshop located near the edge of the village. Not every child spent each day in the fields. Many children gradually learned trades. A trade could become a family's livelihood for generations. Potters raised future potters. Carpenters raised future carpenters. Metal workers taught apprentices. Stonecutters taught apprentices. Knowledge passed from one pair of hands to another. The workshop smelled of wood dust and warm earth. Sunlight entered through an open doorway. Simple tools rested against walls. The room was already alive with activity. An older craftsman examined a piece of wood. Another worker prepared materials. The sounds were steady and rhythmic. Wood scraping. Tools tapping. Voices speaking quietly. Nothing hurried. Nothing wasted. The boy's task was not complicated. He carried materials. He cleaned workspaces. He watched. Most importantly, he watched. Observation was one of the great classrooms of the ancient world. Children learned by seeing. They learned by repeating. They learned by making mistakes and trying again. Hours passed this way. The workshop filled with sunlight. Dust floated through bright beams of morning light. The smell of wood mixed with the smell of clay and sweat. Outside, the village continued its daily rhythm. Merchants prepared goods. Women baked bread. Children carried water. Farmers tended crops. Life unfolded exactly as it had yesterday. Exactly as it would tomorrow. Yet within these repeated days, childhood slowly moved forward. A child who carried tools this year might shape tools next year. A child who watched today might teach someone else years later. Growth happened gradually. So gradually that it was often difficult to notice. As morning became late morning, the heat returned. Sunlight poured across rooftops and roads. Dusty paths brightened beneath the harsh glare. The air became heavier. Inside the workshop, workers wiped sweat from their foreheads. Outside, the village moved more slowly. The Egyptian sun demanded respect. No one ignored it. No one could. The boy stepped outside briefly. The light was almost blinding. The desert beyond the fertile valley shimmered beneath waves of heat. Looking toward it, he could see endless stretches of sand and stone. The contrast between desert and river remained remarkable. One side seemed harsh and dry. The other supported life. Fields. Villages. Trees. People. The Nile created a narrow ribbon of green through an otherwise unforgiving landscape. Every child understood this truth. They lived it every day. The boy returned to his work. Hours continued to pass. Tasks continued to appear. The rhythm of labor remained steady. Eventually the midday meal arrived. Workers gathered together in a shaded area. Bread was shared. Water was poured. Simple food was eaten slowly. Conversations drifted between practical matters. Someone discussed repairs. Someone discussed crops. Someone discussed a relative in another village. Children listened more than they spoke. Listening was another form of learning. The ancient world carried its wisdom through voices. Advice. Stories. Memories. Warnings. Lessons. These things traveled from generation to generation through conversation. The afternoon brought greater heat. Even shadows seemed warm. Workers paced themselves carefully. Energy had to last until evening. The boy felt tired. His arms felt heavy. His feet ached. Yet everyone around him continued working. Adults continued. Older children continued. The rhythm carried everyone forward. Physical exhaustion was woven into daily life. Not every day felt difficult. But few days felt effortless. Children learned endurance because they saw endurance all around them. They saw it in their parents. They saw it in neighbors. They saw it in grandparents whose hands still worked despite years of labor. As the afternoon stretched onward, the boy thought about another child he knew. A young apprentice scribe. Their lives looked different. While he worked with tools and materials, the apprentice spent long hours studying symbols. The work of a scribe required patience of a different kind. A child learning to write sat for hours practicing signs and characters. Mistakes were corrected repeatedly. Exercises were copied again and again. The training could last many years. The body might suffer less from physical labor, but the discipline remained demanding. The ancient world offered few easy paths. Every role required effort. Every skill required dedication. The apprentice scribe sat cross-legged in a room filled with other students. Sunlight filtered through openings high in the walls. Reeds used for writing rested nearby. Sheets for practice lay spread before them. The teacher moved among students quietly. Correction followed correction. Practice followed practice. Outside, the sounds of daily life continued. Inside, concentration filled the room. The young apprentice carefully copied another line. Then another. Then another. Hours passed. The symbols slowly became more familiar. The hands slowly became steadier. The lesson continued. Elsewhere, farmers continued tending fields. Fishermen continued checking nets. Potters continued shaping clay. Throughout Egypt, childhood unfolded through work and instruction. Not because adults wished to burden children. Because survival required preparation. Children were future workers. Future parents. Future craftsmen. Future farmers. The lessons could not wait until adulthood. They began early. As afternoon finally softened into evening, relief spread across the land. The sunlight lost some of its harshness. The air became easier to breathe. Shadows stretched across roads and fields. Workers began preparing to return home. The boy left the workshop. His clothes carried traces of dust. His hands were dirty. His body felt tired. Yet he also felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The day had been useful. Something had been learned. Something had been completed. The village welcomed the return of evening. Cooking fires appeared once more. The smell of bread drifted through narrow streets. Neighbors greeted one another. Children gathered water. Animals settled into familiar places. The entire community seemed to breathe more easily. The worst heat had passed. The boy walked slowly toward home. The sky above him glowed with shades of gold and orange. The Nile reflected every color. Its surface shimmered beneath the fading sunlight. For a moment he paused. The river always seemed different at sunset. The water looked softer. The sounds felt calmer. Boats returning home moved gently across the glowing surface. Fishermen secured ropes. Birds crossed the sky. Even after seeing it every day, the sight remained beautiful. Back at home, the family gathered for the evening meal. The oil lamp flickered softly. Its warm light touched the walls. Food was shared. Conversation flowed quietly. The day's stories were exchanged. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extraordinary. Simple moments from ordinary lives. Yet these moments mattered. They formed the fabric of family life. They created memories. They created belonging. After eating, the boy stepped outside once more. Night was returning. Stars appeared overhead one by one. The air felt cooler now. A breeze moved through the village. The smell of the river lingered in the darkness. Somewhere nearby, someone told a story. Elsewhere, laughter drifted briefly through the night before fading away. Gradually, silence returned. Families prepared for sleep. The boy lay down on his mat. His eyes felt heavy. The labor of the day rested inside every muscle. Outside, the Nile continued flowing beneath the stars. The river had watched countless children grow. Children who worked in fields. Children who learned trades. Children who carried water. Children who baked bread. Children who became adults before they fully realized childhood had ended. And as the cool night deepened around the village, another peaceful evening settled over the valley, while the river flowed steadily onward beneath the endless Egyptian sky. The Nile flowed through the darkness with patient certainty. Its waters slipped past sleeping villages and quiet fields. Moonlight rested upon the river in long silver ribbons that trembled gently whenever the current shifted. Along the banks, reeds swayed softly in the night breeze. Their faint rustling blended with the distant sounds of insects hidden among the grasses. The valley was asleep. Workers rested after another day beneath the sun. Children rested after another day of learning, carrying, lifting, walking, and helping. The world seemed still. Yet even in stillness, life continued. The river continued. The stars continued. Time continued. Inside a mud-brick home near a bend in the Nile, an elderly grandmother remained awake for a little while longer than the others. Age had changed her sleeping habits. The deep sleep of childhood had become lighter over the years. She sat quietly beside a small oil lamp and listened to the sounds of the night. The lamp flickered. The room glowed softly. Nearby, grandchildren slept peacefully upon woven mats. Their breathing rose and fell in slow rhythms. The grandmother watched them for a moment. She had once been a child like them. Long ago she had carried water from the river. Long ago she had helped prepare grain. Long ago she had awakened before sunrise and followed the same routines that shaped every generation. The faces around her seemed familiar in a way that reached beyond family resemblance. Every generation carried traces of the one before it. Children inherited skills. Children inherited stories. Children inherited responsibilities. Eventually the lamp was extinguished. Darkness filled the room. The grandmother settled onto her mat. The village became silent once more. Hours passed. The stars slowly wheeled across the sky. Then, little by little, dawn approached. The eastern horizon brightened with a pale glow. Birds stirred among palm branches. The first sounds of morning emerged from the darkness. A rooster called. A door opened. Footsteps crossed a courtyard. The day was beginning again. In another home, a young boy awoke before the rest of his family. For a few moments he simply listened. The air felt cool. The room felt peaceful. Outside, the world remained suspended between night and morning. These moments were rare. Soon the village would be busy. Soon voices would fill the streets. Soon tools would strike wood and stone. But for now, everything remained calm. The boy stepped outside. The sky above the desert glowed faintly. The Nile reflected the first hints of daylight. Mist hovered close to the water in a few places, drifting slowly above the surface before disappearing into the warming air. He walked toward the riverbank. Many children found reasons to visit the Nile whenever possible. The river offered movement in a world governed by routine. No two reflections looked exactly the same. No two mornings looked exactly the same. The current carried new leaves, new reeds, and new patterns upon its surface every day. The boy crouched near the edge of the water. He dipped his fingers into the river. The water felt cool. Refreshing. For a brief moment he simply watched the current flow around his hand. Then voices sounded behind him. Other villagers were arriving. Women carrying jars. Fishermen preparing boats. Workers collecting water before beginning their day. Morning was unfolding. The boy returned home. Inside, breakfast preparations were already underway. Grain was being ground. Dough was being shaped. The familiar smell of bread slowly filled the room. Every household seemed connected to that smell. It drifted through villages at sunrise and sunset alike. The scent of baking bread became part of childhood itself. A memory carried throughout life. The boy helped where he could. His tasks were simple. Fetching items. Carrying small containers. Cleaning tools. These small responsibilities accumulated over years. Each task taught something. Each task prepared him for larger duties later. No lesson seemed particularly important by itself. Yet together they formed the foundation of adulthood. After eating, he accompanied his older brother toward the river. Today they would help repair fishing nets. Fishing supported countless families along the Nile. The river provided food year after year. Fish appeared regularly on tables throughout the valley. Yet catching them required effort. Nets required maintenance. Boats required maintenance. Everything required maintenance. Ancient life often involved preserving what already existed. Resources were valuable. Nothing useful was discarded carelessly. The brothers reached the riverbank. Several fishermen were already seated beneath a shaded structure made from reeds and wooden poles. They worked patiently with their hands. Small tiers in nets were repaired one knot at a time. The work demanded attention. Children learned quickly that many important tasks were not exciting. Many important tasks were repetitive. The fishermen understood this well. A neglected net could mean fewer fish. Fewer fish could mean less food. Small details mattered. The boy sat down beside his brother. Together they worked quietly. The river flowed nearby. Birds skimmed across the water. Occasionally a boat passed. The scene possessed a peaceful rhythm. Hours seemed to drift by almost unnoticed. Meanwhile, farther inland, farmers worked among fields nourished by Nile water. The morning sun climbed higher. Its warmth spread steadily across the valley. Workers moved carefully through rows of crops. Children assisted wherever they could. Some carried baskets. Some watched animals. Some helped clear weeds. Each task appeared modest. Yet countless modest tasks combined to sustain entire communities. The ancient world depended upon cooperation. No single person could manage everything alone. Families functioned because everyone contributed according to ability. Even young children often found ways to help. The heat gradually increased. By late morning, sunlight reflected brightly from walls, roads, and water alike. Dust rose beneath passing feet. The air felt heavier. Workers adjusted their pace accordingly. They had spent entire lives learning how to work beneath the Egyptian sun. They understood its power. They respected its limits. Near midday, a merchant arrived from another settlement. His donkey carried goods secured in woven baskets. The arrival attracted quiet attention. News traveled slowly in the ancient world. Visitors often brought information along with goods. People gathered briefly. Conversations began. Questions were exchanged. Children listened from nearby. The merchant described villages farther down the river. He described harvest conditions. He described market activity. Nothing dramatic. Nothing urgent. Simply pieces of ordinary life from distant places. To many children, such stories felt fascinating. Their own world often extended only as far as neighboring settlements. Hearing about unfamiliar villages awakened curiosity. What did other homes look like? What foods did they eat? What tasks filled their days? The answers were often surprisingly familiar. Across Egypt, daily life shared many similarities. Different villages. Different families. Yet the same river. The same sun. The same routines. As noon approached, activity slowed. The heat settled heavily upon the valley. Workers sought shade where they could find it. The boy and his brother carried repaired nets into a sheltered storage area. Their work was finished for now. Nearby, fishermen rested briefly before returning to their duties. The brothers sat beneath a palm tree. Its shadow provided welcome relief. The breeze from the river felt cool against their skin. For a while they simply sat and watched the water. No conversation was necessary. Silence was common in ancient life. People spent many hours working side by side without speaking constantly. The sounds of the environment often filled the space instead. Water, wind, birds, footsteps, tools. These sounds formed the background music of everyday existence. Eventually the afternoon arrived. The sun began its slow descent, though the heat remained. The village resumed its steady rhythm. Work continued. Repairs continued. Meals were prepared. Children completed their responsibilities. The hours passed as they always did. One after another. Slowly. Predictably. Like the river itself. As evening approached, the quality of light began to change. Golden tones spread across the landscape. Fields glowed warmly. Mud-brick walls softened in appearance. The Nile became a ribbon of liquid gold. The boy watched fishermen guiding boats toward shore. Their silhouettes moved peacefully across the water. The sight seemed timeless. Perhaps it had looked much the same for hundreds of years. Perhaps it would look much the same for hundreds more. The river connected generations in that way. The same waters touched countless lives. The same sunset illuminated countless faces. Back in the village, cooking fires appeared once more. Smoke rose gently into the evening sky. The smell of bread drifted through narrow paths. Families gathered. Children returned home. Workers stretched tired muscles. The day gradually folded itself into memory. The boy sat beside his family while food was shared. The oil lamp cast a warm glow across familiar faces. Conversation flowed quietly. An uncle spoke about repairing a roof. A neighbor discussed the condition of a canal. A grandmother remembered something from many years ago. The topics were simple. Yet simplicity filled most of life. History often appears grand when viewed from a distance. But from within it, life usually consisted of ordinary evenings exactly like this one. Meals. Stories. Family. Rest. The boy listened until his eyelids grew heavy. The labor of the day settled over him. Outside, stars appeared once again above the valley. The river reflected them faithfully. One by one, voices faded. One by one, lamps were extinguished. The village drifted toward silence. And beneath the endless Egyptian sky, beside the patient waters of the Nile, another peaceful night began its slow journey toward morning. The night deepened over the Nile Valley. Stars filled the sky from one horizon to the other. They hung above the river like tiny lamps, their reflections trembling upon the dark water. Along the shore, reeds moved gently whenever a breeze drifted through them. The air carried the scent of wet earth, cooling stone, and distant cooking fires that had long since faded into glowing embers. Most of the village was asleep. The day's labor had settled into tired muscles and heavy eyelids. Children who had spent the day carrying water, tending animals, helping in workshops, or assisting in fields now rested quietly beside their families. Their hands were still. Their feet were still. Their minds had drifted into dreams. The Nile alone seemed fully awake. It flowed through the darkness without pause. Generation after generation had fallen asleep beside its waters. Generation after generation had awakened beside those same waters. The river had witnessed countless childhoods. Some had been joyful. Some had been difficult. Most had been ordinary. An ordinary life was what filled the valley. Not grand ceremonies. Not magnificent temples. Not the names remembered by history. Most lives unfolded quietly among fields, workshops, boats, and homes. Most childhoods were shaped by routine. Inside one home near the edge of a farming settlement, a young girl slept lightly. The evening breeze entered through a small opening near the roof. It carried a little coolness with it. She shifted slightly on her woven mat and listened for a moment without fully waking. Nearby, younger children slept soundly. An older relative snored softly. The room smelled faintly of grain, clay, and smoke from the cooking fire used earlier in the evening. These scents formed part of daily existence. Children grew up surrounded by them. Years later, many would still associate such smells with home. The hours slipped quietly by. Eventually, the stars began their slow retreat before the coming dawn. Darkness softened. The eastern horizon became a pale shade of gray. Birds stirred among the palms. A rooster called. Morning was returning once again. The girl opened her eyes. For a few moments she remained still. The room was peaceful. Outside, only a handful of villagers were awake. The air felt fresh. Soon the heat would arrive, but not yet. These early hours belonged to cool breezes and soft light. She sat up and stretched. Her arms felt slightly sore from yesterday's work. That feeling was familiar. It accompanied many children through their lives. Not because they were constantly suffering. Rather because physical effort was woven into daily life. Bodies adapted to it. Children adapted to it. The girl stood and stepped outside. The village was slowly awakening. A woman crossed a courtyard carrying a basket. A farmer adjusted a tool over his shoulder. Someone was already preparing a cooking fire. Thin strands of smoke rose into the brightening sky. The smell of bread would soon follow. It almost always did. The girl walked toward a small storage area beside her family's home. Today she would help prepare supplies for the coming days. Life in ancient Egypt required planning. Grain had to be stored. Tools had to be maintained. Clothing had to be repaired. Food had to be prepared long before it was needed. Much of life revolved around preparation. The tasks themselves were often repetitive. Yet they carried importance. A small oversight today could create a larger problem later. Children learned this lesson early. Responsibility often arrived in small portions. One task. Then another. Then another. Over time, those small responsibilities accumulated into adulthood. As sunlight spread across the village, more people emerged from their homes. Doors opened. Voices appeared. Footsteps echoed along dusty paths. The day unfolded in its familiar way. Nearby, an elderly man sat beneath a shaded area repairing a woven basket. His fingers moved carefully despite his age. Children often watched older relatives perform such work. There was much to learn from experienced hands. The old man had spent decades making repairs. He understood how fibers behaved. He understood where weakness appeared. He understood patience. Patience seemed to exist everywhere in ancient Egypt. Perhaps it came from living beside the river. The Nile itself taught patience. Its floods followed seasons. Its waters moved steadily. Nothing happened instantly. The natural world moved according to its own pace. People learned to do the same. The girl spent part of the morning helping sort grain. The task required attention. Small stones needed to be removed. Damaged kernels needed to be discarded. The work was not exciting. Many important tasks were not exciting. Yet these quiet activities occupied much of daily life. Children often became skilled at finding calm within repetition. The rhythm of the work itself became soothing. Hands moved. Time passed. The morning continued. Outside, sunlight grew brighter. The village became busier. Nearby, a group of boys guided goats toward grazing areas. The animals moved reluctantly at first. Dust rose beneath their hooves. The boys laughed briefly as they encouraged the goats along the path. Moments of playfulness existed within responsibility. Children still found opportunities for games. They still found reasons to smile. Yet those moments usually appeared between duties rather than replacing them. Farther down the road, a carpenter worked beneath a simple shelter. The steady sound of tools striking wood drifted through the air. An apprentice stood nearby watching closely. The apprentice's role today was mostly observation. Tomorrow it might involve carrying materials. Later it might involve shaping wood. Every skill began with watching. The ancient world relied heavily upon observation. Knowledge rarely arrived through written instructions for ordinary people. It arrived through demonstration, through repetition, through memory. As the sun climbed higher, the heat gradually returned. Shadows shortened. The air became heavier. The village adjusted its pace. People moved more deliberately. Energy was conserved. Children learned this rhythm naturally. Morning often brought greater activity. Midday encouraged caution. Evening offered relief. The pattern repeated day after day. The girl carried a water jar from one area of the home to another. The weight pulled gently against her arms. Water was precious. Every drop mattered. The Nile provided abundance compared to many lands, yet obtaining and transporting water still required effort. Children carried countless jars throughout their lives. The movement became familiar. The balance became natural. The responsibility became ordinary. Later, she joined her mother in preparing food. Vegetables were cleaned. Grain was measured. Clay vessels were arranged. The work unfolded without hurry. There was no reason to rush. The meal would be ready when it was ready. Many tasks in ancient life followed that same principle. Time was measured more by sunlight than by clocks. People paid attention to the position of the sun, to the length of shadows, to the changing colors of the sky. Nature provided the schedule. By midday, the heat covered the valley like a blanket. Even the breeze seemed warm. The girl sat with her family during the meal. Simple food was shared. Simple conversation followed. Nearby, younger children listened while older relatives spoke. Stories drifted naturally through the gathering. Some were memories. Some were lessons. Some were observations about everyday life. Children absorbed these conversations quietly. Many lessons arrived indirectly. Not as formal instruction, but as stories told during meals and evenings. Afterward came a quieter period. The hottest part of the day encouraged rest whenever possible. Some workers paused briefly beneath shade. Others focused on indoor tasks. The village seemed calmer. The bright sunlight outside made interiors feel especially cool and welcoming. The girl sat near a doorway and watched the light. Dust floated through the air. The distant sounds of the village continued. A donkey calling. A child laughing. A hammer striking wood. A fisherman returning along the river. These sounds formed the familiar landscape of daily life. Hours passed. The afternoon gradually softened. The worst heat began to fade. Activity increased once more. People returned to unfinished tasks. Children resumed responsibilities. The village slowly came alive again. The girl accompanied an older relative on a short walk toward the river. The path wound between fields and clusters of reeds. The Nile shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Several boats drifted quietly upon the water. Fishermen checked nets. Birds skimmed low across the surface. The river looked peaceful. It almost always looked peaceful. Yet everyone understood how much depended upon it. Without the river, there would be no fields. Without fields, there would be no harvest. Without harvest, there would be no village. The Nile connected every part of life. Standing beside it, the girl listened to the sound of water touching the shore. The rhythm felt calming. The same sound had soothed generations before her. The same sound would soothe generations after her. For a few moments, there was nothing to do. Nothing to carry. Nothing to repair. Nothing to prepare. Only the river. Only the breeze. Only the afternoon sunlight dancing upon the water. Then it was time to return. Evening approached. The sky slowly shifted toward gold. Long shadows stretched across the fields. Workers made their way home. Cooking fires began appearing throughout the village. The smell of bread returned once again. It drifted through narrow pathways and open doorways. Children followed familiar routes home. Parents gathered with relatives. The entire settlement seemed to settle into a softer rhythm. Inside the girl's home, the evening meal was prepared. The oil lamp flickered after darkness arrived. Its warm light danced across the walls. Family members gathered close together. The day's stories were exchanged. Someone spoke of a repaired roof. Someone mentioned a neighbor's harvest. Someone remembered an event from years ago. The conversations were gentle, unhurried, comfortable. Outside, the stars returned one by one. The Nile reflected them in silence. The village gradually became quiet. Children yawned. Parents stretched tired muscles. Lamps dimmed. Sleeping mats were arranged. The girl lay down beside her family. The coolness of night slowly replaced the warmth of day. Her eyes grew heavy. Outside, the river continued its endless journey beneath the stars. And while the Nile flowed quietly through the darkness, another ordinary day faded into memory, joining thousands of other ordinary days that together formed the true story of childhood in ancient Egypt. The stars shone brightly above the Nile Valley. They seemed almost endless on clear nights, scattered across the sky like tiny points of silver light. The river carried their reflections upon its dark surface, stretching them into trembling lines that moved gently with the current. The village slept. A cool breeze drifted through narrow lanes between mud-brick homes. It slipped through doorways left partly open to welcome the night air. It crossed rooftops where some families slept beneath the open sky during the hottest seasons of the year. The day's heat had faded at last. The earth itself seemed to be resting. Fields stood silent beneath the moonlight. Palm trees cast long shadows. Fishing boats rocked gently along the shore. For a few precious hours, the valley belonged to quietness. Inside one home, a young boy slept beside his brothers. Their mats were arranged close together. The room was simple. A few storage jars stood against one wall. Woven baskets rested nearby. Tools used throughout the day waited silently for morning. Nothing in the room was extravagant. Almost everything served a practical purpose. Children growing up in ancient Egypt became familiar with such surroundings from the very beginning of life. Comfort often came not from possessions but from familiarity. The familiar smell of home. The familiar sound of family members breathing nearby. The familiar sight of the same walls that had sheltered them every night. These things created a sense of security. The hours moved slowly. The stars crossed overhead. Then at last the eastern horizon began to brighten. Night gradually loosened its grip upon the valley. A faint gray glow appeared beyond the desert. Birds awakened among reeds and palms. The first sounds of morning drifted through the air. The boy opened his eyes. For a moment he simply listened. The village was beginning to stir. A door opened somewhere nearby. Footsteps crossed a courtyard. A donkey shifted and shook itself awake. Morning had arrived once more. He sat up slowly. His body still carried traces of yesterday's fatigue. The soreness in his arms felt familiar. The stiffness in his legs felt familiar. Neither surprised him. Children accustomed to regular labor learn to expect such feelings. They became part of daily life. Outside, dawn painted the world in soft colors. The Nile reflected pale gold light. Mist hovered briefly above parts of the river before disappearing into the warming air. The boy stepped outdoors. The coolness felt pleasant. Soon enough, the sun would rise higher. Soon enough, the heat would return. But for now the world felt calm. Fresh. Unhurried. His father was already awake. Together they began preparing for the day. The family's donkey needed attention. Supplies needed organizing. Small tasks waited patiently. Ancient life was filled with small tasks. Many were easily forgotten by history. Yet they occupied much of every day. Repairing ropes. Cleaning tools. Checking storage jars. Mending baskets. Preparing grain. Fetching water. Life depended upon these ordinary responsibilities. The boy helped where he could. Each task taught something useful. Each task strengthened habits that would remain with him throughout life. As sunlight spread across the village, activity increased. Cooking fires appeared. The smell of baking bread drifted through the air. Women carried jars. Children carried baskets. Workers prepared for long hours ahead. The village moved together like a living rhythm. Everyone knew their role. Everyone understood the pattern. The boy's family planned to visit a nearby area of farmland today. The journey was not far. They walked along dusty paths bordered by fields nourished by Nile water. The land looked green and fertile compared to the desert beyond. The contrast remained striking. To one side stretched life. To the other stretched endless sand. Every child growing up in the Nile Valley understood this contrast instinctively. The river created a narrow world of abundance surrounded by a much harsher landscape. The family reached the fields. Morning sunlight glittered upon irrigation channels. Water moved quietly through carefully maintained pathways. These channels required constant attention. Silt accumulated. Banks needed repairs. Blockages needed removal. Children often helped with such work. It was not glamorous. It rarely appeared in stories. Yet it mattered deeply. Without irrigation, crops would suffer. Without crops, families would suffer. The boy joined others in clearing a section of canal. The work required patience. Mud clung to hands and feet. The sun climbed steadily. Sweat appeared. The rhythm of labor settled in. Hours passed. Nearby, older workers spoke occasionally while they worked. Their conversations drifted through the morning air. Sometimes they discussed crops. Sometimes they discussed neighbors. Sometimes they remembered events from years ago. Children listened quietly. Listening was one of the most important forms of learning. The ancient world depended heavily upon memory. Knowledge lived inside people. Stories lived inside people. Experience lived inside people. The boy absorbed these conversations without realizing how many details would remain with him years later. As the morning progressed, the fields filled with activity. Farmers moved among rows of grain. Workers guided animals. Children carried tools. Birds searched for insects near the water. The valley seemed alive from one horizon to the other. Yet despite the activity, there was little urgency. Tasks were completed steadily. The pace followed the rhythm of the land itself. No one expected immediate results. Plants required time. Harvests required time. Life required time. Patience surrounded everything. By late morning, the sun shone brightly overhead. The heat returned with growing strength. Shadows shortened. The air became heavier. Workers slowed slightly. They conserved energy. Years of experience had taught them when to push forward and when to move carefully. The boy wiped sweat from his forehead and looked toward the Nile. The river gleamed in the distance. Its steady presence felt reassuring. No matter what work filled the day, the river remained there. Flowing. Shining. Enduring. At midday, workers gathered for a meal. They sat wherever shade could be found. A tree. A wall. A simple shelter. Bread was shared. Water was shared. Conversation drifted lazily through the warm air. The boy listened to an older farmer describe floods from many years earlier. The man's voice moved slowly. His memories seemed almost as old as the river itself. Children often grew up surrounded by such stories. Not dramatic tales of kings. Not accounts of distant battles. But memories of seasons. Memories of harvests. Memories of family members. The history of ordinary people passed from one generation to the next through these quiet conversations. After the meal came the hottest hours of the day. The sunlight felt intense. Even the birds seemed quieter. The village in the distance appeared slightly blurred through shimmering waves of heat. The boy continued working. The afternoon stretched onward. Task followed task. Minute followed minute. The work itself became almost meditative. Hands moved. Tools moved. Thoughts drifted. The rhythm continued. Many children experienced life this way. Long periods of repetition. Long periods of steady effort. The repetition shaped character. It shaped expectations. It shaped understanding. The world taught lessons through routine rather than explanation. Eventually the quality of light began to change. The sun lowered. The shadows lengthened. The worst heat faded little by little. A feeling of relief spread among the workers. Even the air seemed easier to breathe. The boy noticed birds becoming active again. He noticed the changing colors of the fields. He noticed the golden light settling across the landscape. Evening was approaching. The family gathered their tools and began the walk home. Dust rose softly beneath their sandals. The path looked beautiful beneath the fading sunlight. Fields glowed gold. Palm trees stood dark against the bright sky. The Nile reflected orange and pink colors. Moments like this appeared often in ancient Egypt. Quiet moments. Beautiful moments. Moments that existed without ceremony. The boy walked beside his father. Neither spoke very much. They did not need to. The silence felt comfortable. The day had been long. Words could wait. Back in the village, familiar smells welcomed them home. Bread baking. Vegetables cooking. Smoke drifting upward from small fires. Children returned from various tasks. Workers exchanged greetings. Animals settled into their evening routines. The entire community seemed to relax together. Inside the home, preparations for the evening meal continued. The boy helped briefly before sitting near the doorway. Outside, darkness slowly returned. The first stars appeared overhead. Their arrival felt almost ceremonial after the brightness of the day. One by one they emerged. Soon the sky would be full of them. The family gathered for dinner. The oil lamp flickered softly. Its light cast warm shadows across the walls. Food was shared. Stories were shared. The ordinary details of the day were shared. No one thought of these moments as history. Yet they were history. The real history of most people who ever lived. Simple evenings spent with family after long days of work. The boy listened quietly. His eyes grew heavy. The labor of the day rested upon him. The warmth of the room felt comforting. The familiar voices around him felt comforting. Eventually the lamp burned lower. The conversations became softer. One by one, family members prepared for sleep. The boy lay down upon his mat. Outside, the Nile flowed beneath the stars. Its waters reflected the same constellations that countless generations had watched before him. The village became still. The night breeze moved gently through the darkness. And as another peaceful evening settled over the valley, the ancient river continued its endless journey through the heart of Egypt, carrying time itself quietly forward. The Nile flowed beneath the stars. Its dark waters moved through the valley with the same steady rhythm they had carried for thousands of years. Along the riverbanks, reeds bent gently beneath the night breeze. The soft rustling seemed to rise and fall with the movement of the water itself. The villages beside the river were quiet now. Doors had been closed. Cooking fires had burned low. Oil lamps had been extinguished one by one. Families rested after another day of labor. The night belonged to silence. Above, the stars stretched endlessly across the sky. Children in ancient Egypt grew up beneath these same constellations. They watched them appear after sunset and fade before dawn. The stars became familiar companions throughout life. A child might not know every name given to them. A child might not understand every story connected to them. But the sight itself became part of memory. Night after night. Year after year. The stars remained. Inside a modest mud-brick home near the river, a young girl slept peacefully beside her family. The room was simple. Storage jars lined one wall. A woven basket rested near the doorway. A few folded pieces of cloth sat neatly in a corner. Everything had a purpose. There was little space for unnecessary things. Life was practical. Resources were valuable. Children learned early to care for possessions because replacing them often required time and labor. The girl's breathing remained slow and steady. Outside, the village rested beneath the moonlight. Only a few people remained awake. A fisherman checking a rope. A watchman walking slowly through a larger settlement nearby. An elderly woman unable to sleep. Otherwise, the valley belonged to darkness. The hours passed gently. The stars moved across the sky. Eventually, the first signs of dawn appeared. A pale gray light touched the eastern horizon. The darkness softened. Birds awakened among palm trees. The Nile began reflecting the colors of morning. Another day was arriving. The girl opened her eyes. For a moment she simply listened. The familiar sounds of dawn had already begun. A clay vessel being lifted. Footsteps outside. A distant animal calling. The quiet crackle of a newly lit cooking fire. The village was waking. She sat up slowly. The coolness of early morning remained inside the room. It felt pleasant after the warmth of the previous afternoon. Nearby, her mother was preparing grain. The motion was familiar. Children often awoke to the sound of work already beginning. Many parents rose before sunrise. There was much to do before the day truly started. The girl stood and stretched. Her muscles felt slightly tired. Yesterday's task still lingered in her body. Yet the feeling hardly seemed unusual. Most people carried small traces of yesterday into today. The rhythm of labor connected one day to the next. Outside, dawn painted the village in soft colors. The air smelled fresh. The Nile gleamed in the distance. Palm trees stood motionless beneath the brightening sky. For a few brief moments, everything felt calm and unhurried. Then activity gradually increased. Doors opened. Neighbors greeted one another. Children carried baskets. Workers gathered tools. The day began unfolding once again. The girl helped prepare breakfast. Bread was divided carefully. Water was poured into simple cups. The meal was modest. Yet it provided strength for the hours ahead. Food was never taken for granted. Everyone understood how much work stood behind even the simplest meal. Fields had been planted. Water had been carried. Grain had been harvested and ground. Bread represented effort. Children understood this from an early age. After eating, the girl joined her mother on a walk toward a nearby marketplace. It was not a large market. Only a gathering of merchants and villagers exchanging goods. Yet to a child, such places often felt interesting. There was always something to observe. Something to learn. The road leading there was dusty. Their sandals stirred small clouds of dirt with each step. The morning sun climbed steadily higher. The village behind them slowly disappeared from view. Ahead, other travelers walked the same path. Some carried baskets. Some guided donkeys. Some balanced jars upon their shoulders. Everyone moved at a steady pace. Nobody hurried. There was little reason to hurry. Life followed the pace of walking feet. When they arrived, the market was already active. Merchants arranged goods beneath simple shelters. Vegetables rested in woven baskets. Fish caught from the Nile lay upon mats. Pottery stood in neat rows. Bundles of reeds and cloth waited nearby. The air carried many scents. Fresh bread. Dust. River fish. Clay. Smoke. Children growing up in Egypt became familiar with these smells. They formed part of everyday life. The girl remained close to her mother while observing the scene. She watched merchants discussing prices. She watched customers examining goods. She watched donkeys carrying heavy loads through narrow spaces. The market was not loud by modern standards. Yet compared to the quiet fields and homes, it felt lively. Many children learned important lessons here. They learned how goods moved between people. They learned how communities depended upon exchange. They learned that every object represented someone's labor. A clay pot required a potter. A basket required a weaver. A loaf of bread required a farmer, a grinder of grain, and a baker. Everything connected. Everything depended upon human effort. As the morning continued, the sun rose higher. Heat gradually settled over the landscape. The girl and her mother completed their errands. Then they began walking home. The return journey felt warmer. The road seemed brighter. Shadows had shortened. The familiar Egyptian heat was returning. Back at home, daily tasks resumed. The market visit had been only one small part of the day. There was still grain to prepare, water to carry, repairs to make. Children often learned that life continued regardless of where they had been. Responsibilities waited patiently. The girl spent part of the afternoon helping an older relative weave a basket. The work required concentration. Reeds were bent carefully. Patterns were followed carefully. Mistakes could weaken the finished basket. The relative's hands moved with remarkable confidence. Years of practice guided every motion. The girl watched closely. Observation remained one of the greatest teachers. No written instructions explained each step. The knowledge existed inside experienced hands. Children learned by watching those hands. Then by copying them. Then by practicing until the movements felt natural. Hours passed. The heat intensified. Outside, sunlight shimmered across rooftops and dusty roads. Inside, the weaving continued. The rhythm felt calming. Reed after reed. Row after row. The basket slowly took shape. Ancient life often moved this way. Progress appeared gradually. A field grew gradually. A wall rose gradually. A child matured gradually. Patience was woven into nearly everything. By midday, the village grew quieter. The hottest hours encouraged slower movement. People sought shade. Animals rested. Even the wind seemed to pause. The girl sat near a doorway where a slight breeze occasionally entered. Beyond the village, she could see a portion of the Nile shining beneath the sun. The sight always seemed comforting. The river connected every part of life. It provided water. It provided food. It provided transportation. It provided fertile soil. Children grew up understanding its importance without needing lengthy explanations. The river's presence explained everything. As afternoon slowly advanced, activity resumed. The harsh brightness softened slightly. People returned to unfinished tasks. The village regained its steady rhythm. Children moved between homes. Workers returned from fields. The sounds of daily life drifted through the air once more. The girl accompanied her younger brother to gather reeds near the riverbank. The walk offered a welcome change of scenery. The Nile sparkled beneath the afternoon sunlight. Boats moved slowly across the water. Birds glided above the surface. The river looked peaceful. It almost always did. The siblings worked quietly. Bundles of reeds were gathered and tied together. The task was simple. Yet simple tasks filled much of childhood. Simple tasks filled much of adulthood as well. Life rarely consisted of dramatic moments. Instead, it consisted of countless ordinary moments joined together. As the sun moved lower, golden light spread across the valley. The fields glowed warmly. Palm trees cast long shadows. The heat finally began to weaken. A feeling of relief settled over the land. Workers started making their way home. The girl and her brother followed. Dusty paths led them back toward the village. The smell of evening cooking fires greeted them before they even arrived. Smoke rose gently into the sky. Voices drifted through the air. The familiar rhythm of evening had begun. Inside the home, preparations for dinner continued. The oil lamp would soon be lit. Stories would soon be shared. Children would soon listen while adults discussed the events of the day. The routine repeated itself almost every evening. Yet repetition did not make it meaningless. The repetition itself created a sense of belonging. A sense of stability. A sense of home. As darkness gradually returned and the first stars appeared above the Nile, the girl settled beside her family. The day's work was finished. The evening felt peaceful. Outside, the river continued its endless journey beneath the night sky. And throughout the valley, thousands of other children were ending their own ordinary days in much the same way, surrounded by family, tired from labor, and slowly drifting toward sleep while the ancient world settled quietly into darkness once again. The evening faded slowly across the Nile Valley. The last traces of sunlight disappeared beyond the western desert, leaving behind a sky filled with deep shades of blue. One by one, the stars emerged. They appeared first above the darker horizon, then spread across the heavens until the entire sky seemed filled with gentle points of light. The Nile reflected them all. Its waters moved quietly through the darkness, carrying silver ripples beneath the moonlight. Along the shore, boats rested where fishermen had tied them for the night. Nets hung drying nearby. Reeds whispered softly whenever the breeze passed through them. The valley was growing quiet. Families had gathered for their evening meals. Stories had been shared. Children had listened while older voices filled the warm glow of oil lamps. Now the day was coming to rest. Inside a home near the river, a young boy lay awake for a few moments before sleep arrived. His body felt heavy from the work of the day. His hands were rough from carrying bundles of reeds. His feet still remembered the dusty roads he had walked. Yet there was comfort in this tiredness. The work was finished. Tomorrow could wait. For now there was only darkness, the sound of family breathing nearby, and the distant murmur of the river. Eventually his eyes closed. The night continued. Hours passed. The stars crossed slowly overhead. The moon drifted westward. The coolness deepened. And while the village slept, the Nile flowed onward, unchanged by human schedules. It had witnessed countless nights like this one. Countless children had fallen asleep beside its waters. Some dreamed of becoming skilled craftsmen. Some dreamed of becoming scribes. Some dreamed of owning boats or fields. Many dreamed only of tomorrow's simple routines. The river watched them all. Then, as always, morning approached. The eastern horizon brightened gradually. Dark blue became gray. Gray became silver. Silver became gold. Birds awakened among palm trees and reeds. Their calls drifted across the water. The first villagers stirred from sleep. A cooking fire crackled to life. A door opened. Footsteps crossed a courtyard. The day was beginning again. The boy awoke. For a few moments he listened to the sounds of dawn. The village always seemed gentler at this hour. The air felt cooler. The light felt softer. Even voices seemed quieter. He sat up and rubbed his eyes. Nearby, his mother was already preparing the morning meal. The familiar smell of grain and baking bread drifted through the room. Children throughout Egypt awoke to similar scents. The smell of bread was woven deeply into daily life. It greeted people in the morning. It welcomed them in the evening. It accompanied celebrations and ordinary days alike. After eating, the boy stepped outside. The sky was brightening rapidly now. Golden light spread across rooftops and fields. The Nile shimmered in the distance. A few fishermen were already pushing their boats into the water. Others checked ropes and nets before beginning their work. The boy watched them briefly. Fishing required patience. Hours could pass with little excitement. The river taught that patience naturally. Children who spent time near fishermen learned how to wait. They learned how to observe. They learned how to notice small details. Soon the boy joined his father. Today they would travel to a nearby workshop where stone workers were repairing part of a building. The journey took them along a dusty road that followed the edge of cultivated land. Fields stretched beside them. Workers moved among rows of crops. Water flowed through irrigation channels. The landscape looked peaceful beneath the morning sunlight. As they walked, the boy noticed how many people were already busy. Women carrying water jars. Children guiding animals. Farmers inspecting fields. Merchants preparing goods for transport. The day had barely begun, yet work was already underway. Such was life in ancient Egypt. The rhythm started early. The rhythm ended late. The rhythm rarely stopped. Eventually they reached the workshop. The sound of stone being shaped echoed through the air. Tap. 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 The sound repeated steadily. Several craftsmen were already at work. Their tools moved with practiced precision. Dust gathered around their feet. Fragments of stone lay nearby. The boy stood quietly and watched. Stoneworking demanded skill. A careless strike could ruin hours of effort. Patience and attention were essential. The craftsmen understood this. Their movements were calm, measured, confident. The boy's role was simple. He carried water. He moved tools from one place to another. He swept away loose debris. None of the tasks seemed important by themselves. Yet every task supported the larger work. Ancient life often functioned this way. Many small efforts combined to create something greater. A building rose because countless people contributed. A harvest succeeded because countless people contributed. A household functioned because countless people contributed. Children learned this lesson simply by participating in daily life. As morning advanced, the workshop became warmer. Sunlight entered through open spaces. Dust floated through bright beams of light. Workers wiped sweat from their foreheads. The Egyptian sun was beginning its daily climb. The boy paused for a moment and looked outside. Beyond the workshop he could see the distant Nile. The river seemed calm, untroubled, steady. No matter how busy the village became, the river always appeared patient. Its presence offered a quiet sense of reassurance. The hours passed. The sounds of tools continued. Conversations drifted between craftsmen. Children listened while adults exchanged practical knowledge. Advice about materials. Advice about repairs. Advice about techniques learned through years of experience. Much of this knowledge existed nowhere except in memory. It passed from one person to another through conversation and observation. The boy absorbed more than he realized. Children often did. By midday, the heat had arrived fully. The air shimmered above the ground. Stone surfaces radiated warmth. Even standing still required effort. Workers gathered beneath a shaded area for a meal. Bread was shared. Water was shared. A few dates were passed around. The simple meal felt welcome. Nearby, an older craftsman began telling a story about his apprenticeship many years earlier. The younger workers listened. So did the children. The story was not dramatic. It described mistakes he had made, lessons he had learned, people who had taught him. Such stories formed an important part of childhood. They offered guidance without sounding like instruction. The boy listened carefully. One day he too would have stories of his own. One day younger children would listen to him. The cycle continued. Generation after generation. After the meal, work resumed. The afternoon stretched ahead. The hottest hours settled over the valley. Shadows grew short. Dust seemed to hang motionless in the air. The pace slowed slightly. Not because people became lazy. Because experience taught them how to endure the heat wisely. The boy continued helping. His arms grew tired. His shoulders felt heavy. Yet he carried on. Everyone around him carried on. Endurance was not celebrated with grand speeches. It was simply expected. Ordinary people practiced endurance every day. The afternoon moved slowly. Like the river. Like the seasons. Like childhood itself. Nothing seemed to change quickly. Yet change was happening all the time. Children were growing. Skills were improving. Knowledge was accumulating. A child who watched today would understand more tomorrow. A child who practiced today would work more confidently tomorrow. Growth often arrived quietly. Almost invisibly. As the sun began descending toward the western horizon, relief spread through the workshop. The light softened. The air became slightly easier to bear. Long shadows returned. Workers gathered their tools. The day's labor was nearly complete. The boy and his father started their journey home. The road looked beautiful beneath the golden evening light. Fields glowed softly. Palm trees cast long dark shapes across the earth. The Nile reflected orange and gold colors. Birds crossed the sky on their way to resting places. Everything seemed calmer now. The rush of work had faded. Even the village ahead appeared softer in the evening light. As they approached home, familiar smells greeted them. Bread baking. Vegetables cooking. Smoke drifting upward from cooking fires. The scents felt welcoming. Comforting. The boy entered the house and joined his family. Soon the evening meal was shared. Voices filled the room. The day's experiences became stories. Someone described work in the fields. Someone described a visit from a merchant. Someone described a repaired tool. The details were ordinary. Yet these ordinary details formed the texture of life itself. Outside, darkness returned. The stars emerged once more above the Nile Valley. The river reflected them patiently. The village gradually became silent. Oil lamps dimmed. Children yawned. Workers stretched tired muscles. One by one, families prepared for sleep. The boy settled onto his mat. His eyes grew heavy. His body welcomed rest. Outside, the Nile continued its endless journey beneath the stars. And as the cool night breeze moved through the reeds along the shore, another peaceful day joined the countless days that had come before it, becoming part of the quiet, enduring story of childhood beside the ancient river. The Nile moved through the darkness like a slow ribbon of shadow. Moonlight rested upon its surface. Here and there, small ripples caught the silver light and carried it downstream. Along the banks, reeds swayed gently. The sound was soft enough that it blended with the breathing of the night itself. The valley slept. After another day of work, families rested behind walls of mud brick and clay. Cooking fires had long since faded. The smell of smoke lingered faintly in the air, mixing with the scent of river water and fertile soil. The stars seemed especially bright tonight. Without great fires or bright lights filling the land, the sky appeared vast and endless. Children growing up beside the Nile spent their lives beneath this immense ceiling of stars. Many nights, they fell asleep looking at them. Many mornings, they woke before the stars had completely disappeared. The heavens became part of their daily rhythm, just as much as the river and the sun. Inside a small house near the edge of a village, a young boy shifted slightly on his mat. He slept beside two brothers. Nearby, his parents rested after a long day. The room was simple. Storage jars lined one wall. A wooden stool sat near the doorway. Several woven baskets hung from pegs. Nothing seemed luxurious. Yet everything had a purpose. Children growing up in ancient Egypt learned very early that useful things mattered. Objects were valued because they served a function. A basket held grain. A jar stored water. A tool helped complete work. Every possession represented labor. Someone had made it. Someone had carried it. Someone had traded for it. The boy slept deeply. His hands still carried traces of yesterday's work. The small scratches and calluses of childhood were common sights. Many children spent their days helping families with practical tasks. The marks of labor appeared gradually. Not all at once. Little by little. Season by season. Year by year. Outside, the Nile continued flowing. The hours passed. The stars drifted slowly westward. Then, almost unnoticed, dawn began its quiet arrival. A faint gray light appeared along the eastern horizon. The darkness softened. Birds stirred among palm leaves. The cool air felt fresh and clean. Morning was returning. The village awakened slowly. A door opened. A rooster called. A donkey shifted in its enclosure. Smoke began rising from the first cooking fires. The familiar rhythm was beginning once again. The boy opened his eyes. For a moment he listened. Every morning seemed to begin with sounds. Not loud sounds. Gentle sounds. The small noises of ordinary life. A clay vessel being lifted. A broom brushing across a floor. The crackling of a fire. Footsteps crossing packed earth. These sounds formed the music of childhood. They greeted children each morning and followed them throughout the day. The boy stood and stepped outside. The dawn air felt pleasant against his skin. The village still rested in soft light. Long shadows stretched across the ground. The Nile reflected pale shades of silver and gold. For a few moments, the world seemed peaceful and still. Then work began. It always began. Today, the boy's family planned to help with grain storage. The previous harvest had already been gathered, dried, and prepared. Now much of the work involved protecting those supplies from moisture, pests, and damage. Children often helped with such tasks. The work required attention rather than strength. Large baskets needed organizing. Storage areas needed cleaning. Grain needed inspection. At first glance, these responsibilities seemed unremarkable. Yet they were deeply important. Food represented security. Food represented survival. Entire communities depended upon careful preparation. The boy joined several family members inside a storage building. The air smelled of grain and dry earth. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight entering from small openings near the roof. The atmosphere felt warm and quiet. Voices remained low. People focused on their tasks. The boy carried baskets from one area to another. He checked containers. He listened to instructions. The work continued steadily. Outside, the village became busier. Farmers headed toward fields. Boats moved onto the river. Merchants prepared journeys. Craftsmen opened workshops. The entire community seemed to awaken together. Every person had responsibilities waiting. Every person contributed in some way. As the morning progressed, sunlight grew brighter. The air warmed. Children moved between tasks. Adults moved between tasks. The rhythm remained steady. Many childhood memories were built from these ordinary hours. Not dramatic events. Not unusual adventures. Simply long stretches of daily life. The smell of bread. The warmth of sunlight. The sound of sandals against dusty roads. The sight of the Nile glimmering in the distance. These small details became the foundation of memory. Later in life, people often remembered them most clearly. By mid-morning, the boy's work brought him outside again. He carried a small basket toward another building near the edge of the village. As he walked, he observed the world around him. Women carrying water jars. Children chasing a stubborn goat. An elderly man repairing a rope. A merchant adjusting goods on a donkey. None of these scenes seemed extraordinary. Yet together they formed the true landscape of ancient life. History often remembers monuments. But ordinary people spent most of their lives among scenes like these. The boy delivered the basket and continued walking. A narrow path led toward the river. The Nile sparkled beneath the growing sunlight. Fishing boats drifted nearby. Birds stood along the shoreline searching for food. The sight felt calming. The river always seemed larger than daily worries. Larger than individual lives. Children sensed this even if they could not explain it. The Nile appeared permanent. Steady. Reliable. Its presence provided comfort. The boy paused briefly beneath a palm tree. The shade felt cool. The breeze carried the scent of water. For a few moments, he simply watched the river flow. Moments of stillness existed within childhood too. Not every hour involved labor. Sometimes there were pauses. Moments for observation. Moments for thought. Moments for simply sitting beside the water and listening. Soon enough, responsibilities called him back. The day continued. The sun climbed higher. Heat spread across the valley. The familiar warmth settled over roads, fields, and rooftops. By midday, workers began seeking shade whenever possible. Meals were shared. Water was poured from clay jars. Conversations moved slowly through the warm air. The boy sat beside older relatives while eating. Nearby, an elderly grandfather spoke about years long past. He described a flood season from his youth. He described fields stretching green beneath a successful harvest. He described people whose names were now rarely spoken. The boy listened carefully. Children often absorbed family history this way. Not through written records. Not through formal lessons. Through stories. Through memory. Through voices passing knowledge from one generation to the next. The afternoon arrived. The heat deepened. The village seemed quieter now. Even animals moved more slowly. Dust hung motionless in the air. The boy returned to his tasks. Hours passed steadily. The rhythm of work continued. A basket moved here. A container cleaned there. A short walk across the village. Another small responsibility completed. One task blended into the next. Many childhood days felt exactly like this. Simple. Predictable. Steady. And yet these ordinary days slowly shaped the person a child would become. Skills accumulated. Confidence accumulated. Knowledge accumulated. The transformation happened gradually. So gradually that it was difficult to notice. Then one day, a child discovered that certain tasks no longer seemed difficult. Certain responsibilities no longer seemed unfamiliar. The lessons of years had quietly taken root. As afternoon softened toward evening, the sunlight changed. The harsh brightness eased. Long shadows returned. The village seemed to breathe again. Workers finished their tasks. Boats returned to shore. Children completed final chores. The smell of cooking fires drifted through the air. Evening had arrived. The boy walked home beneath the sky turning gold. The Nile reflected warm colors. Palm trees stood dark against the glowing horizon. The scene felt peaceful. The day's labor was ending. Inside the home, preparations for dinner were already underway. Bread rested on woven trays. Vegetables simmered nearby. Family members gathered. Voices filled the room. The familiar comfort of evening settled over everyone. Soon darkness would return. Soon the stars would emerge once more above the valley. And the Nile, patient as ever, would continue its endless journey through the heart of Egypt while another ordinary day quietly became part of memory. Evening settled over the Nile Valley with gentle certainty. The last light of the sun lingered for a little while upon the river. Golden reflections stretched across the water, broken only by the movement of boats returning toward shore. Fishermen guided their vessels carefully through familiar channels. Their silhouettes appeared dark against the glowing horizon. The day was ending. Workers walked home along dusty roads. Children carried the final baskets and tools of the afternoon. Animals were led into shelters. The sounds of labor gradually faded. In their place came the softer sounds of evening. Voices. Footsteps. The crackling of cooking fires. The murmur of families gathering together. A young girl sat outside her home and watched the changing sky. The heat of the day was finally beginning to loosen its grip on the land. A breeze drifted from the river. It carried the scent of water and fertile earth. The air felt easier to breathe now. More comfortable. Many people looked forward to this hour. After long days beneath the Egyptian sun, evening brought relief. The girl watched birds crossing the sky in small groups. They moved toward places where they would rest for the night. Their dark shapes passed beneath clouds painted orange and pink by the setting sun. Nearby, several younger children played briefly before dinner. Their laughter drifted through the air. It was not loud. Not wild. Just the simple sound of children enjoying a few moments free from responsibility. Even in lives filled with work, small spaces for play still existed. A game with pebbles. A race down a familiar path. A story imagined beneath a tree. Childhood always found ways to appear. Soon the girl's mother called her inside. The evening meal was nearly ready. She stood and entered the house. The room glowed warmly beneath the light of an oil lamp. Its flame flickered softly. Shadows danced across the mud-brick walls. The atmosphere felt peaceful. Comforting. The family gathered together. Bread was shared. Water was poured. Simple food was placed before them. The meal was not extravagant. Most meals were not. Yet after a day of labor, even simple food felt satisfying. Everyone ate slowly. Conversation flowed naturally. An uncle described a repair completed earlier that day. A grandmother remembered a season from many years ago. A younger child asked a question about birds seen near the river. The topics were ordinary. The kind of conversations that filled countless evenings throughout ancient Egypt. No one knew they were creating history. They were simply living. The girl listened quietly. She enjoyed hearing older relatives speak. Stories carried a special weight in the ancient world. Without books available to most people, stories became important containers for memory. Family history traveled through stories. Practical knowledge traveled through stories. Lessons traveled through stories. Children often learned simply by listening. After the meal, the family remained together for a while. No one hurried to leave. Outside, darkness slowly spread across the village. The first stars appeared overhead. The evening breeze continued moving through the settlement. Some people sat outside their homes. Others visited neighbors. A few older children completed final chores before bed. The pace of life slowed. The day's responsibilities had mostly ended. For a little while, people could simply rest. The girl stepped outside again. She looked toward the Nile. The river reflected the moonlight now. Its surface appeared almost black except where silver light touched it. The sight felt familiar. She had seen it countless times. Yet it never seemed exactly the same. The river changed with the light, with the weather, with the season. And still it remained the center of life. Nearby, an elderly fisherman sat repairing part of a net. His fingers moved carefully despite the fading light. The work was slow, patient. The girl watched for a few moments. Many children learned simply by observing adults. No formal lesson was taking place. No instructions were being given. Yet learning was happening. The fisherman knew how to repair a net because someone had once shown him. The person who taught him had learned from someone else. Knowledge flowed through generations much like the Nile itself. One person passing it to another. The stars multiplied overhead. Soon the entire sky was filled with them. The village grew quieter. One by one, families prepared for sleep. The girl returned inside. Sleeping mats were arranged. The oil lamp burned lower. The room grew dim. Her younger brother was already asleep. The long day had exhausted him. Others would soon follow. The girl lay down and listened. Outside, the sounds of the village faded gradually. A distant conversation. A door closing. The faint movement of animals settling for the night. Then silence. Or nearly silence. The Nile still moved. The breeze still whispered through the reeds. The night still carried tiny sounds that became noticeable only when everything else had stopped. The girl closed her eyes. Sleep arrived gently. And while she slept, the river continued its journey. Hours passed. The moon crossed the sky. The stars shifted slowly overhead. The valley rested. The earth cooled. The darkness deepened. Then, just as it always did, morning approached. A pale glow appeared beyond the eastern desert. The stars began fading. Birds awakened. The air felt fresh and cool. Another day was waiting. The girl opened her eyes before sunrise. For a few moments she remained still. The room felt peaceful. The coolness of dawn lingered inside the house. Soon enough, the warmth would return. Soon enough, the work would begin. But not yet. These early moments belonged to quiet, to stillness, to possibility. She sat up and listened. The village was only beginning to wake. A nearby cooking fire crackled softly. Someone swept a courtyard. A jar was lifted. Footsteps crossed packed earth. The familiar sounds of morning returned. The cycle continued. Day after day. Season after season. Year after year. The girl stepped outside. The sky glowed softly above the horizon. The Nile reflected pale gold light. Mist drifted low above parts of the water. The scene looked beautiful in its simplicity. No grand monuments were needed. No ceremonies. No celebrations. Just the river. The sunrise. The quiet beginning of another day. Soon she joined her mother in preparing breakfast. Grain was measured. Dough was shaped. The smell of bread slowly filled the home. It was one of the most familiar scents in her life. One of the scents she would likely remember even as an old woman. The work unfolded calmly. There was no hurry. Only routine. Only repetition. Only the steady rhythm that shaped childhood. After breakfast, the girl accompanied her mother to fetch water. Together they walked toward the Nile. The path felt familiar beneath their sandals. Dust rose gently with each step. Around them, the village was fully awakening. Farmers headed toward fields. Merchants prepared goods. Children carried baskets. The day was underway. At the riverbank, the morning sunlight sparkled upon the water. Fishermen were already at work. Boats drifted quietly nearby. Birds searched among the reeds. The girl filled her jar carefully. The water felt cool against her hands. For a moment she watched the current move past. Always moving. Always flowing. Never stopping. The river seemed eternal. A child could spend an entire lifetime beside it and still find comfort in its presence. The journey home felt peaceful. The jar was heavy. Her arms worked against the weight. Yet she carried it steadily. Children throughout Egypt performed similar tasks every day. The work was ordinary. Yet it built strength. Patience. Endurance. Qualities valued throughout life. Back in the village, the sun continued rising. The day stretched ahead. More tasks waited. More lessons waited. More ordinary moments waited. And like countless children before her, the girl stepped forward into another day shaped by family, responsibility, routine, and the quiet presence of the Nile flowing endlessly beside the ancient world. The morning unfolded slowly across the Nile Valley. Golden sunlight spread over the fields, touching the tops of date palms and the flat roofs of mud-brick homes. The river shimmered softly beneath the growing light. Gentle ripples moved across its surface, carrying reflections of birds gliding low over the water. The air was still cool. For a little while longer, the heat remained far away. Workers understood the value of these early hours. Children understood it too. Much could be accomplished before the sun climbed high into the sky. The young girl walked beside her mother through the village. The water jar they had filled rested carefully against her hip. It felt heavy, but the weight was familiar. She adjusted her grip and continued along the dusty path. Around her, the village had fully awakened. Voices drifted from open doorways. The smell of fresh bread floated through the air. A donkey stood patiently beside a cart. Nearby, a group of boys guided a few goats toward grazing land. Everything felt ordinary. Everything felt familiar. This was the world most children knew. Not grand temples. Not royal courts. Not distant monuments. Their world was made of homes, roads, fields, workshops, and the river. The girl reached home and carefully placed the water jar beside several others. Her mother nodded with quiet approval. No great praise was given. Children rarely expected it. Responsibilities were simply part of life. Completing them felt natural. The reward often came from knowing the task was finished and useful. Soon another task appeared. There was always another task. This morning, grain needed grinding. The girl sat beside a stone grinder and began working. The motion was repetitive. Forward. Back. Forward. Back. The rhythm settled into her arms. Many children spent hours performing activities like this. The work was slow. Yet the slowness itself became familiar. Ancient life moved at the pace of human hands. Nothing happened instantly. Everything required effort. Everything required time. As she worked, sunlight entered the room through a small opening. Dust floated through the bright beam. The particles moved lazily in the air. Outside, the sounds of the village continued. Workers calling to one another. Footsteps passing by. A distant hammer striking wood. The world felt alive but never rushed. The girl listened while older relatives spoke nearby. Their conversation drifted between practical matters. A field that needed attention. A route that required repair. A neighbor who planned to travel downriver. Children absorbed such conversations almost without realizing it. Little by little, they learned how communities functioned. Little by little, they learned what adulthood looked like. The morning advanced. The sun rose higher. The coolness began fading. Warmth spread across the village. The shadows shortened. The smell of sun-warmed earth filled the air. Eventually the grain was finished. The girl stretched her arms. They felt tired. Not painfully tired. Simply used. Many ancient children became familiar with this sensation. Their bodies adapted to regular labor. Strength developed gradually. Not through exercise for its own sake, but through daily life. Through carrying. Through lifting. Through walking. Through helping. Outside, several children gathered beneath the shade of a palm tree. For a short while, they were free from immediate responsibilities. The girl joined them. They sat together quietly. Some talked. Some watched birds moving through the sky. One child traced shapes in the dust using a stick. There was no elaborate entertainment. No complex toys. Yet children still found ways to enjoy one another's company. Simple moments often felt sufficient. A conversation. A shared observation. A brief game. The pleasures of childhood frequently emerged from ordinary circumstances. Soon enough, the pause ended. Families called children back to work. The rhythm resumed. The girl accompanied an older relative toward a weaving area located near the edge of the village. Several women sat together beneath a shaded structure. Bundles of reeds and fibers rested nearby. Hands moved steadily. Threads crossed one another. Patterns emerged slowly. The work demanded concentration. The girl watched carefully. Watching was important. Before doing came watching. Before mastery came observation. Generations of children learned this way. A teacher was not always someone standing before a group. A teacher could simply be an experienced adult working nearby. Every movement offered a lesson. Every repetition offered another opportunity to learn. The weaving continued for hours. The sunlight grew stronger. The heat settled over the valley. Outside, the air shimmered above the dusty roads. The Nile reflected brilliant light. Even the birds seemed quieter now. Midday was approaching. The hottest part of the day often changed the rhythm of work. People adapted naturally. Tasks requiring great effort were often completed earlier when possible. Shade became valuable. Water became valuable. Rest became valuable. The girl carried several finished items into storage. The cool interior felt pleasant compared to the brightness outside. Clay walls helped keep temperatures lower. Many people sought similar relief during the hottest hours. The village seemed slower now. More subdued. The heat encouraged patience. At midday, the family gathered for a meal. The room felt calm. Bread was shared. Vegetables were shared. Water was passed from person to person. Everyone ate quietly at first. The labor of the morning had created hunger. Only after a few moments did conversation begin. The girl's grandfather sat nearby. His face carried the marks of many years spent beneath the sun. His hands showed the memory of countless tasks completed over a lifetime. Today he spoke about the river. Not in a grand or mysterious way. Simply in the way older people often reflected upon familiar things. He remembered years when the flood waters had risen high. He remembered years when they had risen less. He remembered traveling by boat when he was young. The girl listened. The stories moved slowly. Like the river itself. Children often heard the same memories more than once. Yet repetition rarely seemed bothersome. The stories became part of family life. Part of identity. Part of belonging. After the meal, some family members rested briefly. Others continued lighter tasks indoors. The afternoon heat pressed heavily upon the village. Outside, the roads looked almost empty. The bright sunlight seemed to fill every corner of the landscape. The girl sat near a doorway. A slight breeze occasionally entered. She watched the light changing upon the ground. Sometimes childhood included moments like this. Moments of waiting. Moments of observation. Moments when nothing particular happened. Modern minds might call such moments uneventful. Yet they formed a large part of life. Children became comfortable with stillness. Comfortable with quiet. Comfortable with simply being present. As the afternoon continued, the sunlight slowly softened. The heat remained, but relief was coming. Long shadows began stretching across the earth once again. Workers emerged from shaded areas. Activity gradually increased. The village seemed to awaken for a second time. The girl accompanied her older brother toward the riverbank. They carried several baskets that needed washing. The path wound through familiar areas of the settlement. Neighbors greeted one another. Children moved between homes. The smell of cooking fires had not yet arrived, but preparations were beginning. The river welcomed them with its steady presence. The water sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. Fishing boats drifted nearby. A fisherman stood carefully balancing while checking a net. Birds circled overhead. The siblings settled beside the shore and began cleaning the baskets. The work was simple. Water splashed softly. The river flowed. The breeze moved through the reeds. For a while, neither child spoke much. There was no need. The landscape itself seemed to encourage quiet reflection. The Nile had that effect on people. Its movement was calm. Its sounds were gentle. Its presence felt constant. As the baskets dried nearby, the girl watched the current. She wondered where the water had come from. She wondered where it would go. Children often ask such questions. Not always aloud. Sometimes only in their own thoughts. The river inspired curiosity. It connected places beyond what most children would ever see. Eventually the sun began lowering toward the western horizon. The sky changed color. Gold appeared. Then orange. The entire valley seemed softer. Kinder. The hardest part of the day had passed. People made their way home. The smell of bread returned to the air. Cooking fires flickered to life across the village. The girl and her brother gathered the baskets and started walking back. Their shadows stretched long across the dusty path. The evening breeze felt wonderful after the long heat of the day. Around them, the village settled into its familiar evening rhythm. Families reunited. Workers returned from fields and workshops. Children completed final chores. The promise of rest waited just ahead. And as the Nile reflected the glowing colors of sunset, another ordinary day of childhood moved gently toward night, joining countless others in the quiet and enduring story of life beside the ancient river. The sun had long since disappeared beyond the western horizon. Evening settled softly across the Nile Valley. The last cooking fires glowed faintly in the darkness. Their warmth lingered in the air while thin trails of smoke drifted upward and disappeared among the stars. The busy sounds of the day had faded away. Workshops were quiet. Fields rested beneath the night sky. Boats lay still beside the riverbank. The Nile continued its endless journey. Its waters moved gently through the darkness, reflecting moonlight and starlight as they had done for countless generations. Along its shores, reeds whispered in the cool breeze. Palm trees stood motionless against the sky. Families gathered one final time before sleep. Oil lamps flickered inside mud-brick homes. Children listened to the familiar voices of parents and grandparents. Some were already drifting toward dreams. Others fought sleep for a few moments longer, wanting to remain near the warmth of family and the comfort of home. The ordinary labors of the day were finished. The grain had been ground. The water had been carried. The bread had been baked. The nets had been repaired. The fields had been tended. The countless small tasks that filled a life had quietly reached their end for another day. And in that simple ending, there was peace. The story of childhood in ancient Egypt was rarely a story of luxury. It was a story of routine. A story of repetition. A story shaped by sunlit mornings, dusty roads, warm bread, tired muscles, and the steady presence of the river. Children learned by watching. They learned by helping. They learned by growing slowly into the responsibilities waiting for them. Their days were not separated from the lives of adults. They walked the same paths. Worked beside the same fields. Listened to the same stories. Watched the same stars. And year after year, those ordinary days gathered together to form a lifetime. Now the village grows quiet. The conversations become softer. The lamps burn lower. One by one, families settle onto woven mats. The cool air of night moves gently through open doorways. Outside, the Nile flows beneath the stars. The water carries moonlight across its surface. The reeds sway softly along the shore. A distant bird calls once and then falls silent. The ancient valley rests. The river continues. The stars remain. And somewhere beside those calm waters, beneath the endless Egyptian sky, a child closes their eyes after a long day of work and learning, surrounded by family, wrapped in the familiar sounds of home. The night deepens. The breeze grows softer. The river flows on. And slowly, quietly, everything settles into silence beside the Nile.